Hello, our truth warriors. Today's guest is a fellow Englishman that has been exposing the reality of the world we live in and the dangers this presents. If you didn't see our previous interview regarding the Great Taking, you're going to find that in the link in the description below. What we want to focus on today, though, is one aspect of property rights and the truth behind what we think we own versus who actually does. What we're going to discuss may disturb a few people, but at the end of the day, we are better off being informed than to ignore what is going on. It's great to have back with us here on the Atlantic Underground podcast, our good friend Parallel Mike. Hello, brother. How are you doing?
Yeah, I'm doing great, Chris. Thank you so much for the return invite. I appreciate it, and I'm looking forward to today's discussion.
Yeah, it's always good. We always put a lot of great information out there, and I thank you for coming back on again. I think it's safe to say that even our last interview lit a few fires for people, but today we're going to focus on property rights and discuss that. First off, can you please explain to people here watching now what a property right is?
Yeah, well, really, property rights are a legal construct, and therefore you need a legal system to have property rights. Otherwise, it's a case of guns at dawn and might is right. So whoever's got the most might will come and take whatever's there. So once human beings move towards societies and we have communities, then we have to have some way of ensuring property rights. Like I said, otherwise it would just be people going around looting, which is what happened, by the way. You know, the colonialization of the West, we actually did just go and take stuff and then said, this is ours. And it was might is right who had the best weaponry.
Yeah.
But today we've got property rights because of our legal systems. And what that allows you to do is once you've got property rights, it gives you some defined, I wouldn't even call them benefits. That's the wrong word. It gives you some defined guarantees and assurances as to what you can do. It gives you a superior title, which allows you to do things like sell, inherit, dispose of, destroy, earn an income from, to the exclusion of others. Now, that's the key part, to the exclusion of others. And to have property, it has to be something that's definable. So you could measure off a piece of land and therefore you can have property rights over it. You can, for example, have a solid object, a bar of gold, a diamond. You can even today have non-tangible property rights. So that could be rights to a book, an idea, a patent. It could be an invention that you've come up with. So you can have the tangible property, which is a physical thing, and an intangible one. But key is it has to be something that's legally definable in law. You have to be able to put parameters around it. So if you come across some land, Chris, you could maybe get property rights on the land if you purchased it and you got given a legal title saying Chris is the owner. But what you probably couldn't do is say, I want property rights over the air that travels across my land. And oh, the wind's gone on my neighbor's land. I'm going to take him to court. They'd say no, they'd laugh at you. Although actually today they are trying to get property rights over very abstract things. And that's the natural asset companies, which I've done some episodes on. And maybe we'll touch on that. That'd be an interesting to go down.
It's funny you should say about having rights to the wind because most people are probably not aware of what Monsanto do with their GMO seeds, where they say, well, our seeds have been blown onto your land. And there's a,
There you go.
Yeah.
Yeah. So you can patent nature now. And again, that actually takes it to some quite dark areas because there has been legal attempts to patent DNA, and that's actually been provably possible. But we're going down the wrong track there for now.
I
was saying,
I am going to ask you about that later on as well anyway, so that's all good.
Yeah. So, but essentially, that's what property rights are about. Now, you can't have a free nation without property rights, pure and simple. When the American founding fathers created America, they were trying to get property rights. That was it. That was why they went to war with the British. It had nothing to do with slavery, it had nothing to do with any of those narratives. It was about getting property rights from the crown so that the crown didn't own the land and people in America could live free. And it was also about debt. So that was the two things. It was about property rights and debt. And of course, taxation without representation, which is a form of theft. So when it comes to our modern day system, yes, we can have property rights, but unfortunately, there has been a steady decline in them over time. So if you go back to when America was first created and there was a constitution, the original people that went to America got something called land patents, which gave them property rights, full allodial title, which is something we can talk about later, perhaps. But I'll hand it back to you, Chris, because otherwise I can talk on this for many hours. So I'm going to give it back to you and let you direct this one.
Yeah, well, let's start off with the biggest purchase that most of us would ever make in our lives, and that would be a home. So, firstly, let's discuss the mortgage or mortgage, which is translated to death contract. Let's talk about the creation of it, how many times the bank has paid for it, and the floating of the contracts on the stock exchange, which we saw in 2008 become a massive failure. But yeah, let's get into the property rights of owning a home and the things that are attached to that.
Yeah, so when it comes to your house, I mean, ultimately, you don't own a house with a mortgage on it, pure and simple. What you've got is a title that allows you to use the house. But until you have paid off the mortgage and there is no debt upon the house, there's no lien, and there's no clawback in terms of somebody being able to usurp you and saying, you haven't paid this, we take it off you, then you don't have full title. But arguably, if you're paying taxes on a property, you don't actually truly own it anyways, because if you really owned a property outright, you wouldn't pay any taxes on it. And that's what actually is the case with land patents. If you've got a land patent in the US, you don't pay taxes on the land. If you go to the UK, I think it's around 30 to 40% of land. Nobody truly knows. Nobody truly knows how much is unregistered, but there's about 30 to 40% that's unregistered. And there's no taxation upon that land because nobody knows who owns it, because they didn't put themselves into the legal land registry title system. So, they've got old deeds that are in paper, they keep it in a vault. And this would be the aristocrats, because when William the Conqueror came across to Britain in 1066, what he did was just take all of the land, and he created something called the Domesday Book, which we now call the Doomsday Book. And the reason it was called the Doomsday Book is because what he did, first and foremost, he went around the country and got the entire country surveyed. So every piece of land, every parcel of land, every property, every cow, sheep, goat, every animal. And he said, right, that's all my stuff. It's mine now because I came and conquered the country. And the noblemen that he brought across with him from France to help him conquer the country, who brought their men across, he gave them some of the land as well as a return, as a gift, although he still kept a allodial title to it. And they didn't like that. And that's where the Magna Carta came in and lots of infighting. And if you want to know the true history of Great Britain, you have to understand there's the nobles and there's the king. And it was this to and froing trying to get full property rights for their land that he gave them all those years back. And then later on, about 1,000 years later, when it came to the point where they started doing land registry, they refused to register their land because they understood once you put something in a register, somebody can usurp your property rights. And that's what they actually did. So that's why their land is unencumbered, no mortgage, no registry. And people might say, I want my land registered. No, you don't. You don't want anything registered. You don't want assets registered for that reason. But just going back to where we started on this one. So yeah, when it comes to your house, if somebody has superior title, they actually own the property. It's that simple, Chris. If we go to a court of law, we could have a shared interest in something. And if I've got the superior title and I just take it, that's it. You're done for. Yeah. Even if you've been allowed to live there for 100 years, 1,000 years, it doesn't matter. Now, the problem in the UK is it's written into our Land Registry Act that all land is owned absolutely by the Crown, or to put another way, to give you the actual definition that they give you, the Crown is the only absolute owner of land. Now, that word absolute's really key because what that means is they have superior title to everyone. So the problem there, of course, is it means you could, in theory, have your house taken from you at any point. And if you've got bricks and mortar, you own the bricks and mortar, you own the stuff in the house, but you don't own the land, and therefore somebody could still say, no, you've put something on my land. Now, where you actually see this put into practice is if somebody dies. If somebody dies, there's something called escheat. And what escheat does is it looks for an heir. So if you've got a sibling or if you've got a child, then they'll try and find the heir. But if there is no heir, the land just reverts back to its original owner, which is the Crown. So that's why Prince Charles, now King Charles, he gets all of the housing from people who die with no heirs because it's his land. And that's the way the system works in the UK. Now, of course, outside the UK, where you don't have the Crown who own all of the land legally, what you then have is a number of other systems. But actually, in the world today, there's very few places where you have a allodial title. Most people, what they have is a feudal system, and that's where the mortgage comes in. You are essentially seen as a tenant upon that land. That's why you have freehold. Freehold is a form of It's a form of medieval title, so it goes back to serfdom. So yeah, that's what the freehold is. Now, it doesn't mean that it's bad to have freehold. It doesn't mean that you don't have some rights. But the problem is, if you do see society take a more tyrannical turn, or let's say the government wants to build an airport and you're in the way of it, they can just enact eminent domain because you don't have full title. So that's a long way of saying the kind of title you have and the kind of property rights that you have is extremely important. And it's never, ever more important, Chris, than when you go into times where they're trying to take back wealth, enact some kind of war, or to change society in some fundamental ways, because then all of a sudden you need to know your property rights, and you also need to know the legislation to ensure that you can protect your assets whilst we have what I would say is a taking type event. And if you go back to the period between 1920 and 1940, there was about, I would say, about half a dozen taking events. People say, oh, what about the Great Depression? They talk about each event individually, like World War I, World War II, the Nazis taking the Jewish property in the factories, the Great Depression where the bankers took all of the farms, but they're all a part of one continuum. It was one massive taking and reshaping of society. And I would argue that it looks to me like that's where we're heading to right now. So yeah, you need to understand your property rights, and you need to try and layer in as much property rights as possible onto your assets so that you can survive any attempt, if it is going to happen, to take those property rights from you and to take the property off you.
Yeah, and most people aren't aware as well. I mean, probably the biggest piece of crown land in the world, not to discourage people, but I mean, the crown still own a lot of land around the world, the biggest landmass being Canada, of which they own pretty much all the land in Canada. So those who are watching in Canada, you may own the sticks that your house is built with, or the bricks and mortar that your house is built with, but you do not own the land underneath. And what you have can be taken at any time because of that, because you do not own a Lloydal title, unfortunately. And that's a scary situation when you consider that, regardless of whether it's crown land or not, the very same rules are probably in place under, previous ownership in other countries all around the world, because basically Great Britain at one point, the saying was about the sun setting on the monarchy's land around the world, that, the UK owned pretty much everything. This is where the whole Commonwealth came from. This is why there were so many countries under British rule for so long. And it makes me wonder, based upon that, whether the land is still owned by the Crown itself.
Yeah, well, I think a lot of the laws go back, a good 400, 500, 600 years. Some of them go back 1,000 years. And, the origin of the mortgage actually goes back to the reign of, I can't remember his name. I think it's pronounced something like Artaxerxes. So it's a difficult one to pronounce, but I'm not Persian. But he actually ruled in modern day Iran in the 5th century. And it was the Romans who then formalized this legal process where you would have, well, you'd take the property, but you'd have to pledge some collateral. Then, of course, we changed it to a modern day version where you actually have this kind of ephemeral debt. But going back to what you said, in terms of the true ownership of all this land, yeah, you'd have to go back to the legal structures of that country. And even then, you get to a certain level where it becomes very opaque. Who truly knows who owns private land? Like if you go to Brazil, for example, how do you know who owns like 50%, 60% of the land? You don't. You just assume, And if you see people with the property title to it, how do you know there's not someone superior to that in law? I think one day you do find out potentially. Like I said, I know many examples from history where people have had their property rights just taken overnight. There was a famous story going back to World War One. The family of Archduke Franz Ferdinand, they had their property rights taken after he was killed. So they kicked them out of the country, and they took a lot of the palaces. So and that was when they changed the country over from Serbia, and then they brought it into, I can't remember what it was brought into, excuse me, but during World War One, and there was a legal change that basically said any property of the old monarchy has now been transferred over, and it got transferred over at that point, and they're still fighting to this day to try and get their palaces back. They've got a palace in the Czech Republic that was also part of their title. But when all the borders started getting shifted around, they changed the property title, and they said, well, the old monarchy has to give up all their, or this specific part of the monarchy, should I say, because of course the monarchy is all kind of intermingled, but this specific branch of the family. And, you know, it's the same if you go to, let's say, Russia, you know, after the Tsar Nicholas II was killed, all of that property, who does it go to? Well, of course, it doesn't go to the heirs, because heirs do exist, you know, if you go far enough out. But what they often do during those times is just change the ownership by fiat, you know, say, well, we've changed it. So, you know, ultimately property rights only exist so long as you can assert them and so long as you can protect them. And if not, then it's as good as the paper it's written on, right? You know, so that's why people go to lengths to protect their property rights. And that's why we have things like trusts where people try and bury property in trust. So it's not in my name, it's in somebody else's name, and it's in the Cayman Islands and all, you know. The rich and wealthy elite go to extraordinary lengths to try and retain their assets and property. They understand how it all works, and unfortunately we don't. And that's why we lose our stuff all the time. In history, it's always the little guy who loses first.
And that's it. You know, the monarchy and the hierarchy that you mentioned there, they know how easy it is to lose it, because they know at some point how easy it was to gain it. And that's, as you say, that's where we're going. Let's move on to vehicles, vehicle registration certificates and ownership, and what the situation is with that. Most people believe that when they go out and they buy the car and they finance it and they eventually end up owning it, or they buy it outright initially, that they own that vehicle. But again, there's a little trick at play, isn't there?
Yeah, with a vehicle, it's much the same as any property that's registered. Whenever you register property, you get what they call equitable title. So you get to use it, but you don't have absolute ownership over it. And the reason why they do that, of course, is so they can confiscate the car if they have to. Because if you can go to a court of law and assert full property rights over something, then they can't take it from you. But if you're going to be using their roads and potentially committing offences on the roads, then they don't want that legal barrier. So that's why you get the deeds. Well, it's not a deeds. It's called in the UK, what's it called? Is the VH5, they call it, something like this.
Yeah.
It's just a registration document.
Yeah. You become the registered keeper, but not the owner.
Registered keeper. That's the term. Yeah. So you become the registered keeper. And it's the same where I live. There are legal, like it's the same with the passport, for example. Why can they take your passport off you? Because you are the holder of the passport. You don't own the passport. It's not your property. It's their property. Yeah. And they can take it back. So whenever you are called a keeper, a holder, a possessor, that doesn't mean anything legally. It means you get to borrow it for a time. And it can be confiscated. It can be taken off you. And there's a reason for that, of course. And that's because legally, you are seen as, I mean, even yourself, you are seen as a legal entity. You're not seen as a human being with God-given rights, because if, God forbid, you have God-given rights, Chris, then you'd be able to assert them, and, you know, you'd not be able to have people harass you and take things from you and tax you and all those things. So when you're born, they essentially do create a legal construct for you. And this is easily observable in law. You know, if you go to a court of law, they say, are you Chris Smith? And you say yes, and say, okay, we've got the entity we're looking for. And it's a legal entity. And of course, that's how they can tax you and fine you and do all of these things. But and you know, there's a whole movements out there of people trying to assert sovereignty. Some of them are laughable, some of them are serious. And yeah, it's an interesting wormhole or rabbit hole to go down. And it is a wormhole, actually, Chris, because you don't know where you're going to come out on the other side of it.
No, and that's it. Most people are unaware of something called the strawman, or the principle of strawman. And this is, you know, like you were saying, when you go to court, or where you get something that comes through the post, a bill, an invoice for your bank account, and these things are in all caps name on the documents. You know, we, again, as you mentioned a couple of minutes ago, you are the entity. And unfortunately, because that name reads exactly the same as most people believe it does, most of us will say, well, that is me. Yeah, you know, that bill is mine. This belongs to me. That belongs to me. But when people really look at these things, and again, any certificates, registrations for vehicles, titles to deeds and mortgages, they are written in all caps, which, funnily enough, under the law, doesn't mean it is actually you. And this is a trick that they play, isn't it, in order to dupe people into believing they own things and or are responsible for certain things, when that isn't strictly the truth, is it?
No, I mean, in the world that we've got, I mean, this goes back really to Roman law because that's where they created it. It was Justinian who created this system, and they just expanded it out. And it went back to maritime law because, of course, it was the law of traders and merchants that go around the world, and they created a form of law around that. And then that was kind of expanded to human beings as well, because, you know, if you're going to go into contract with other people, you need to have a legal representative. But it's not Chris Smith, the human being. It's not Chris Smith, the natural person. There's a legal Chris Smith as well. You know, and if you look at your documents, that's the legal representation of you. You know, so it's like a separate person to you. And that is easily evidenceable because, like you said, there is actually no, if you go to, for example, what's the book I'm thinking about? There's a famous one. I think it's the Chicago Style Manual is the most superior of all of the style manuals when it comes to format and grammar in legal documents. And there is no precedent anywhere on planet Earth for using that all caps last name. I mean, was you taught to do that in school, Chris?
No.
Have you ever been taught to use all capitals for a name? No, you capitalize the first letter of the name, and that's it. So the all capitals last name is just impossible for people to decipher. Nobody knows where it came from. Although if you go back, let's say, to the Roman system, there is actually precedent there because there was different styles of names. So they actually used multiple names. There was the cognomen, the pronomen, there was the nomen singular, and all of these were styles of names. And the only one that actually was important was your Christian name, your Christ name, your God-given name, or the name that represents you as a human being. That was the only one that mattered. And all of the other ones were used for legal purposes. And that's how it was originally. So the last name didn't come in from much, much later. You know, it came in around the 1500s in Europe. And there were still people around the 1900s who were refusing to take the last name because they understood that if you had a last name, you could then be registered in a system. So it's much like your vehicle. It's much like your property. Once you get put into the system, you can then be used, taxed, traced, and all the other things that people don't want to be done to them or with their property. It's much the same with human beings. So, you know, there's a whole history there about the last name, and people think, oh, the last name's to identify who I am.
Yeah.
How many Chris Smiths live on planet Earth, do you reckon? What's your guess?
Probably at least a couple of dozen.
I guess we're talking in the, I would guess we're talking in the millions.
Yeah, probably.
Yeah, I think so. It's such a common name. I mean, Smith is one of the most common English last names. Chris is one of the most common first names. I would guess there's millions. So how does that help people identify who you are?
Yeah.
It's a terrible way. Well, for most of history, people didn't identify you that way. Do you know how they'd identify you? They'd call you Chris, son of John, son of Jacob, son of Steve. And then by the time you get 4 in, there is nobody with that lineage. And that's why it was so important to be the son of. It was son of, son of, son of. If you go to the Bible, you have these extensive genealogies. Why? It's such a boring read, but it was because it was so important for identifying exactly who somebody was and where they come from, and later, of course, who owned what, you know, where your property came from. And that is, of course, why all of the noble families say, oh, I traced my lineage back to Muhammad, or I traced my lineage back to, Vlad the Impaler. And they add all of these crazy names to give them prestige, to show that they deserve to be in this position of power. But what we get is the last name. And the last name doesn't tell you much. It just allows them to put you back into this system that they, of course, legitimize by having us all play along with it. But, you know, when did the income tax come in? It came in 1913 with the Federal Reserve Act and the IRS. Same in the UK. You know, the income tax wasn't there. We went to war over the income tax, civil wars. And eventually they got it in, and now you're paying, 5-6 months of your salary each year in taxation. So yeah, these are interesting histories to go down. And I think it's also important for understanding how you are going to interact with a system that sees you as a legal entity, because therefore, if you don't know you're being represented legally, you could get yourself into a whole world of trouble, because a court of law has many terms that are actually completely different to modern common parlance. So me and you might say, someone might say, Chris, are you the man Chris Smith? And you'd say, yes. Well, that can mean something different in a court of law. You know, What does a man mean in a legal dictionary? Go look it up. What does a person mean in a legal dictionary? You might think a person means a human being. A person can refer to a corporation.
Mm-hmm.
Legal personhood can refer to a lake. It can refer to a temple. There's temples that have legal personhood. Over in, I think it's Brazil, there's actually rivers that have legal personhood because it's the local tribe and that's their deity represented in the river. So it actually has legal personhood and legal rights. So, once you understand the difference between a legal right and a natural right, then you're getting into a whole nother world of law, which can be very useful to go down, but you have to be careful too, because I've never seen a space that is more full of scammers and grifters than that space. And I get emails from them quite regularly. I try and take this seriously. Like, if you want to really research law, get yourself the Black's Law Dictionary 6th edition, which is the Roman edition. So that's when they had all of the Roman case law still in and the Roman terminology. That's the best edition. I'd go for that. And then go back and actually study history, not these people who tell you I can get you out of paying your council tax or whatever and trying to get you to buy something. No, go actually do the research yourself, get yourself Black's Law 6, and then go back to the history of Rome and see how that law developed through maritime law. And then you can extrapolate it all the way to today. And you think, wow, it actually is a matrix that goes back about 2,500 years.
Yeah. Yeah. No, we had Cal Washington on a while ago talking about maritime law, Lex Mercatoria, and legalese, and the way that the system is very upside down in regards to a lot of the terminologies, and it is a very deceptive system. And for those that are supposed to represent you when you go to court, unfortunately, they are part of the very system that is trying to bring you down, and they're just there to be the deal makers and appease the courts, and eventually, the lawyers will get wealthy from you paying them, and the courts and the system will get wealthy from whatever they take from you, should you be found guilty for whatever it is they're charging your all caps name with. And again, it's a very dodgy system, but there's a whole new episode we could get into on that. Let's talk about, we all work hard. We all, as you say, get taxed the majority of our money, but that little bit that's left over, we like to put away for a rainy day. Most people will have pension plans, investments, especially in stocks and shares. But let's talk about the ownership rights of pensions, investments, and especially stocks and shares when it comes down to certificates. What we do own, or what we perceive that we own when we part with our money for these investments, and what we actually do own in regards to it, and how this is dangerous moving forward, certainly in the times that we are now.
Yeah, when it comes to, stocks and bonds, again, they're all contractual claims. So as long as you understand that, then you can go into something eyes wide open. But a lot of people don't understand that. And people who manage pension funds don't even understand that. If you call them up and you say, is that, are those my shares? They'll say yes. And you'll say, are they registered in my name? And they'll probably assume that they are, but they're not. Because again, it's a centralized system. So it's much the same as with a car. They register all of the shares to their own entity. And that is something that, there was a book that was written recently called The Great Taking that kind of exposed that, and that's gone everywhere. And we discussed it before. So, it's much the same system. It's a case of, yes, you have the ability to use it. Yes, you have the ability to assert some kind of control over it. So you can sell it. You can get dividends from stocks. You can vote even at shareholder meetings. But what you can't do is have full property rights. And the problem with that is the full property rights. Well, no, you can have them. It's just more complex. But the problem with that is the full property rights allow you to have that controlling interest. So nobody can come along and rehypothecate those shares or use them as collateral. Now, in the system we've got, there are entities that have actually got a superior ownership to you, a superior title, and they're taking your shares without you knowing it. Your brokerage account will say it's there, but they're using those shares as collateral for their debts, for the derivatives complex, which is about 2 to 4 quadrillion in size, which means it's infinitely larger than the amount of collateral that exists. And therefore, if the system comes down, all of the collateral's gone. It's taken.
Yeah.
That's the problem. So, if you understand that, then as an investor, and I'm an investor and I coach clients on how to invest and how to protect their wealth going into these harder times. And we make good money. However, the problem is you've also got to understand the risks involved. That's always the second part of that. It's not about making money. First and foremost, it's like boxing, right? You know, there's that old saying, the old adage, the first rule is don't get hit in the face. You know, and in investing, it's the same. We want to know the risk first before we go after the reward. Anyone can make 1,000% in a year by buying Pepe coin or some other useless asset, you know, because as that rising tide of liquidity comes, it lifts all boats. And if there's a speculative mania, you can jump in. But how do you get out? How do you know when to get out? Well, it's the same with owning stuff. You know, if you've got something and you understand that in the end game, it may not still be there, well, then you'll act very differently. You'll probably prioritize things that give you much more legal, well, that give you actual full title over it. So, for example, gold bullion. Like, there's no pension funds out there right now that use gold. But if you understood that those stocks in the pension fund could get taken, you might say, well, I'm going to buy something like gold. I'm going to have property. I'm going to have land. I'm going to change my life from financialized asset more towards real assets.
Yes.
And, you know, for most of history, that's what people owned. They owned real assets. But it's only in the last 50 years. I mean, 50 years back, people didn't even have pensions. It's only the last 50 years where we've had the state come in and financialize, along with the banking sector, all of our lives and say, oh, you're going to have a pension. I mean, your pension used to be your cow and your produce and your farm, and then you'd have children come and they'd look after you in old age and they'd advance the farm. You know, it was completely different paradigm to what we've got today. And that's lulled people into the false sense of security around property and also around their financial futures. They believe they're going to be protected by these pensions and that someone's going to, you know, take care of them in old age. It's not going to be the family. It's going to be the government.
Yeah.
Sorry to say, it's not going to happen. You know, there's a story that I shared on my channel the other day of a man. He was about to retire in the UK, genuine story. And he called up his investment broker in 2021. And he said, listen, I want my pension transferring to the safest pension fund out there. So they said, oh, of course, you know, yeah, you're going to retire. You don't want to risk a 60% loss in the stock market. That would destroy you in old age. We'll put it into the safest pension fund possible. So they put it into a pension fund that was full of bonds.
Okay.
You know, because bonds used to be the safe asset. For literally all of modern investing history, you had portfolios that were 60% stocks, 40% bonds. As you got older, you upped the bond percentage of the portfolio, you would decrease the stocks. And as you was getting close to retirement, you was nearly all in bonds because bonds were meant to be the stable asset. He lost 60% of his pension in a year. In the safest pension portfolio there was, he lost 60% in a year.
Yeah.
You know, and that's the problem. There is no safe haven out there because all of these financialized assets have been fabricated into bubbles or artificially manipulated using interest rates. So if someone bought bonds in the year 2019 and it was getting 0.1%, okay, maybe not quite so bad. It was like about 1.5%. Or 2% at best, and then 3 years later they're at 5%. That means those 2% bonds are worthless. They've lost 60% of their value. That's what happened. So now this poor guy's going to retire with a, you know, instead of having 300 grand, he's going to have, I don't know, 140. And that 140, what's that going to do for him in old age when you've got inflation running so hot that in 1 year he's probably going to lose 20% purchasing power? You know, it would have been better for him to retire 10 years ago with half the pension pot because it would have bought more back then with half the amount, then double the nominal amount today. And this is the what's the word I'm looking for? Not the psychosis, but the psychopathy of the system right now, in that nobody understands what's happening. All they know is they're getting poorer. And, you know, the solutions were actually very simple. It was to stick towards real assets and to not allow yourself to be put into financialized. But we don't get this education in school, Chris, and it's a tragedy because there are going to be a lot of people who unfortunately find when it comes to retirement that, you know, there's nothing there for them and they're going to have to continue working, or I mean, who knows what? How do you provide for yourself in a world where if we go to a Great Depression scenario, there is no jobs either. So you're dependent on the state, and that's probably not going to be a good place to be moving forwards.
No. And that's it, you know, and it's a system that's designed to fail right now. And the telltale signs are there. When we last spoke, you know, we spoke about people who have these pensions and have the stocks and shares, and the fact that we think, as you said just then, that we own these, when in reality, the property rights of those assets belong to the DTCC and Seed and Co. And in Europe, you've got Euroclear there, which again have a subsidiary. Are we aware of what other countries are doing in regards to this? We know that the DTCC covers the US. We know that Euroclear is covering Europe. What is the systems in place for the UK and the likes of Canada and other countries around the world in regards to companies owning the actual property rights to these stocks and shares because they physically have the share certificates in their possession?
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I've looked into China a little bit, and all countries, all major countries have central securities depositories. And to be fair, I think we should also, for listeners, highlight why they do that. There is actually a reason why they do that as well. It's so that you can immediately buy and sell and transfer shares.
Yeah.
If we was all dealing with the certificates, what would happen is you'd buy some shares, you'd send off for them, they'd create a certificate for you. In 4 weeks, you might get the certificate. Now, if you want to sell that share, you've got to send the certificate off. They've got to get it, re-register it in somebody else's name. And that's a very clunky procedure. So it doesn't create efficiency or the efficient markets that we've got today. So that's why they do it. The
Yeah.
problem isn't necessarily the system. The problem is what they do once the property rights are not held. It's the way it's worded in law. That's the problem with it. I'd be quite happy for them to not give me full property rights over it, so long as I was the superior in the hierarchy if anything went wrong. If I had to give up some property rights for it to be easily transferable or easily bought and sold, I'd be happy so long as there was a legal structure around that still allowed me to have the superior claim. So that's not really the problem for me. The problem is, whilst it's there, it's now being taken by some banksters to be put up as collateral for their debts. That's the problem. And I don't know. And therefore, I wouldn't be so quick to criticize other nations. Like maybe, I don't know, maybe in China, maybe in another country that I haven't looked into, they are doing it in a much safer way. Like, I don't know. I've not got the ability to read Chinese law. So unfortunately, it would take someone over there to fully explain what their system's like. But there's every possibility that they do it differently. Maybe it's just in the West. We don't know. But the problem is, by the time you know, it's going to be probably a little bit too late. So I think it's buyer beware on all of that stuff.
Yeah.
If you go into it with your eyes open, then maybe you'll be able to make smart decisions and see those as vehicles for speculation rather than as wealth preservers. That's the key critical difference. What's wealth preservation? Wealth preservation is something that protects you from unexpected events, from black swan financial events, from property right assertion, from financial crisis, calamities, monetary resets. And I think that's the key one. We're going into a monetary reset. That's what a wealth preserver is. What a speculation is something that you buy as a vehicle to increase your wealth, and then you transfer that wealth back over to wealth preservation. So that's the strategy with stocks. And, yes, we did used to call stocks investments, and I still do as a term, but really knowing the property right situation, I'd see them more as a speculation just during this period whilst we don't know what's going to happen financially. And it looks to me very vulnerable, this financial system. I feel like by the end of this year, we'll have a much clearer picture of where we are globally, but I don't think we're going to be in the same situation. The economic data is terrible. We've got record delinquencies on auto loans, record delinquencies on credit cards in the US. It's not looking good for the consumer. And all of the savings that they had after 2020 because of the stimmy checks are gone. And they're actually in a worse financial situation now than they was pre-2020. So this is kind of the fuse, and we're waiting to see the big one come. And who knows, maybe they pull it off again and they get another year out of this system. I don't know, but I just think as somebody trying to protect their wealth, you have to be careful in this environment, extremely careful.
Yeah, and I'm seeing exactly the same thing. And speaking of banksters, most people think that the cash that they have in their pocket and the cash that is in their bank account, they own. We've got news for those people as well, haven't we?
Yeah, it's the same. At the end of the day, it's printed. It's got no actual intrinsic value anyway. So as a fiat system comes to its end point, what people realize is that those digits on a screen and those paper currencies are actually buying them less and less and less. And that's really when you get to the end of a fiat system. What is a hyperinflation? It's the loss of confidence in the money. And what people do is they rush out to convert their fiat money, their paper notes, or their digits on a screen into real things in anticipation that those things are going to be worth, or that money is going to be worth less and have less value the next day and the next day or the next week. And it used to be with our currencies that, okay, there's inflation, but if you keep £1,000 in the bank, in a year's time, it's probably going to still buy you close to what it used to buy you, and people would accept that. But we're getting to the point now where £1,000 in the bank from 1 year to the next year buys you far less. We was buying wood for our house, we heat our house on wood, and the cost from 1 year to the next was like a 40% increase.
Yeah.
So, of course, my instinct then, as somebody who wants to protect my wealth and not be impoverished, is, well, let's buy double, let's buy triple. And that is the mechanism that leads to the hyperinflation. When the everyday man and woman on the street starts to feel those pressures and see what we're seeing, they do the same. And the first thing they'll rush to, of course, will be gold. Today, it might be Bitcoin too, because people have pushed Bitcoin. So you'll see people run into that, and that could go to crazy levels. And maybe that's what it's there for, is to attract people away from real assets. I don't know. It's up to the individual to make their decisions on it. But I do think we're getting very, very close to that point where people realize the best thing for them to do is to get out of that fiat money, to get out of the digits on a screen and to go to something else. And that really is the death spiral for any financial system. You can look back at any hyperinflation throughout history, whether it's the Hungarian pengo, whether it's the Polish zloty, whether it's the Deutschmark, whichever one you go to, when you get to that end game, at some point, there's a straw that breaks the camel's back. Now, I think what's happening with the gold price right now, with it breaking right through 2000, then 2,100, 2,200, 300, and now it's on the way to 2,400. That's actually close to unprecedented. I've seen moves like that in gold before, but gold shouldn't be doing that. It's not normal for gold to move like a sprinter. It's a marathon runner. But there are periods in history where it does move like a sprinter, like the 1970s. And that's where we saw gold go up 15 times. And that's because the currency devalued, the British pound, 90% over the course of that decade. So it wasn't the end game then. They had more to run. But the problem is, when people see gold go up like that, they're going to start to ask some serious questions. Why is the value of these notes going down? And why is that going up? Maybe I'll buy some of that. And then other people do it, and other people. And how long do you have left once you get to that point? A couple of years, perhaps.
Yeah, definitely. And with the banks, the one thing again, and I still to this day, I don't even know what I was researching the day back in 2013 when I started to find out about the bail-in acts, and I stumbled across the bail-in system in Canada. And, this system is now ready for the swoop. It's in place throughout the banks around the world. But again, we talk about where we think we have legal ownership over the cash that we have in our bank accounts. This bail-in system is absolute proof that we don't. We saw it happen with the likes of Cyprus, where people's money was just taken from their accounts. And the system now is in place to do exactly the same thing. And I'm starting to see moves towards that as the consolidation of some banks is happening, to allow the law to be enacted from some of the bigger players. But can you explain the legality of this now enacted bail-in system so people are aware of how much risk their money is at in those accounts?
Yeah, well, the bailing mechanism was first brought out in Cyprus. So this was when there was the Cypriot banking crisis, and there was a lot of accounts over there that was actually high net worth. So you had a lot of Russians putting their money in Cyprus as an offshore haven. And what happened is, when the major bank out there, I can't remember its name, the top bank out there, basically it was heavily underwater, and that brought down the Cypriot banking system. So what the EU did in their infinite wisdom was say, well, let's just take the money out of the depositors' accounts. We can make a legal system around that. We'll create a law around it. And that's what they essentially tried to do. And it got took to court, and they put that in. So originally, I think it was going to be something like a 60% haircut of all accounts, like anyone, including widows and grandmothers. You know what I mean? Like anyone and everyone. And of course, there was uproar. So then they said, okay, well, we'll take it only of people who have more than, I think it was 100,000 euros. And I think over 50,000, it was less. So they created like a tiered system.
Mm-hmm.
And that was the first time it was used. And once that was used and they got away with it, they said, well, let's not. Why not? Let's do that everywhere. And then the Bank of England put it in, the Bank of Canada, the US, and essentially all of Europe has now done it. All of the West have done it. And that allows them in a crisis, a banking crisis, to take from the depositors' accounts to bail out the bank. And they'll transfer your cash, well, not your cash, your currency in the bank into shares in the failing bank. So you'll get something, Chris. You'll get shares in a failing bank, but maybe you don't want shares in a failing bank. And I would say, you know, there is a difference between cash and your currency in the bank account. The digits on a screen in the bank account can be taken, but the cash at least is a physical property. You actually have that.
Yeah,
they can't take your cash. They can devalue it, and you always have to remember that the cash is just a representation of debt. It's notes that are backing, you know, a debt that's being created, so they can go to zero. But yeah, so that's the bailing system, and it does exist everywhere. And they talk about it all the time. There was an FCIS meeting in the US recently where they were talking about the bailing system, and they were all saying, "Well, we don't want the customers to learn about this one because they might panic. I mean, they are going to get bailed in." And he was literally laughing about it, saying, "Well, they are going to get bailed in a crisis, but we don't want them to panic and know about it because they might pull the money out." And again, you know, it's all about trust. This whole system is about trust. And once you understand the counterparty risk that's in a system, and I've got a lot of videos on my channel where we talk about counterparty risk and the legal system, then it starts to feel a little bit like I'm at the bottom of a list here. Like, you know, you imagine a food chain, you're at the very bottom. You know, what would we say in nature? If you go into a forest, you'll be like the equivalent of a mouse. Or you've got owls, hawks, foxes, everything's after you. That's where you are on the financial food chain. Where you should be is the top dog because it's your stuff. And unfortunately, I think it's just sad that we've allowed ourselves to be duped so much. And it's fine until it's not fine. It's fine until the day that something happened and you wake up and realize, oh, I can't access my bank account. My card's not working. The ATMs are down. Then what do you do? You know, if 90% of your wealth is locked up in financialized assets, and this happened recently, you know, this happens all the time. People don't realize there is mechanisms in the stock market to literally freeze everyone out of their positions. It happened in Russia once the Ukrainian war started. I know somebody who had his account blocked on the day of the war and he couldn't access it for about 3 weeks. And after those 3 weeks, guess what? His positions opened. He opened his day. It opened up on that day. He looked in his account. Those positions were down 90%. He didn't get a say-so. He was locked out of it. You can't sell. You can't buy. You know, that's the same thing can happen to your bank account. It's locked out. Maybe it comes back on in a month, but guess what? They've knocked a few zeros off the currency, or they've devalued it by 70, 80%. This has happened in Argentina. It's happened in Brazil. I know someone in Brazil, his father, one day he woke up, went to the bank account. There was some zeros knocked off the currency. It was worth 20% of what it was worth the day before. Just like that, you know, and you have to learn these stories and you have to research and not feel like this time is different, because look around the world, nothing's different, Chris. It's exactly the same stories that I've read countless examples of in history. You read about the hyperinflation in France, in Germany, throughout Europe. There's been about 50 in the past 30 years alone. So go read about some of them. They happened very recently.
I know. I've been collecting hyperinflated notes for a while. The interest.
Oh, you got a good collection.
Yeah, and you know, I've got some framed to show people, and I often get them out and I'll say, this has happened before, it'll happen again, because the very same people that caused this are the very same people who are going to use exactly the same playbook moving forward. I mean, I'm well aware, and I even think it's going to be this year, that we're going to see failing banks. I think that we're already starting to see a lot of them being absorbed and consolidated by other banks. I know that HSBC in Canada was recently absorbed by the Royal Bank of Canada, because there is only certain banks that have the legal ability to enact this bail-in. I'm under no illusion that the likes of JP Morgan in the US will be one of those earmarked for that. And this is a major concern. I can see this happening now. Do you think we're going to see a lot of banks go under this year and start to be consolidated by the bigger banks that have the legal ability for the bail-in?
You know, I don't know. I have no idea. You know, I really can't answer that one because at the end of the day, I'm not privy to that information. But I do think banks have trillions of dollars of losses on their balance sheets. We know that. from their non-performing bonds, and that's all been swept under the rug because it's not being marked to market. Now, if they allow those things to be marked to market, then yes, the whole banking sector is insolvent. That's it; it's over with. But of course, they're gonna allow it to continue as long as they want to allow it to continue. But that is at the expense of the currency. If you continue a banking system that's insolvent and you don't purge the debt from the system, which at this point would be catastrophic, it would bring down the system anyways. Hence why we are going into a monetary reset at that point. But what they can do is just sacrifice the currency en route to that. So next year, whatever your bank account is this year, it will buy you maybe half what it bought you this year, next year. And then the year after that, it will buy you maybe 10%, and that's the way it will work from here on out. That's why gold's moving. If you go back to the year 2000 and measure the stock market in Great Britain from the year 2000 to today, that's 24 years, Chris, it's moved about 5%.
Yeah.
Actually, no, this year it's just gone over its 2000 peak. So now it's about 30% up. Do you know how much gold is up in the same period of time in the British pound? It's 1,000. It's 1,000%. And you might say, well, that's the great shitty pound. What about, let's say, Japan? Japan is even worse. Japan is up about 1,100%. And the stock market has literally gone nowhere. It has literally just achieved a new all-time high, which is just higher than its 1980 peak.
Yeah.
So it's taken, what are we talking? That's like nearly 40 years, Chris, to just get its all-time high back. And yet, gold's up about 1,100%. And in the Japanese yen, it's gone up 100% in the space of about 2 years. So the gold is telling us something important, that these nominal price increases are fraudulent. It's not real. It's the devaluation of currency. Even the US, which is the supreme dollar, and the S&P 500, the most prestige stock market on planet Earth, it's up about 350% from the year 2000. Gold's up around 650. Yeah. So if gold is outpacing all of the stock markets in the Western world, what does that tell you? It tells you that those gains are nominal gains. The currency is devaluing. So it's not true gains because, of course, gold is the barometer which we measure it by. Now, if you look at Brazil, different story. Believe it or not, even though Brazil's currency is absolute, it's dirty laundry.
Yeah.
However, if you look at the gold price in the Brazilian real versus the stock market, it's about equal. It's about equal. So that shows you that they're growing at a much faster rate, because in the West, we have to spend about $1.50 to get 50 cents worth of growth now. So it's purely debt-based. If you go to Russia, it's the same. In fact, the Russian stock market has outperformed gold since the year 2000. So make of that what you will. You can see this divide, this divergence between West and East. The Western system is crumbling, but these other systems, even with their dodgy currencies, they're actually growing at a much faster rate. And of course, that's the source of a lot of the conflict globally as well.
I mean, this is textbook The Art of War by Sun Tzu. This is other areas of the world, debasing the currency, the damaging the Western world. They don't need a nuclear war. They don't really need war. I mean, I know that that's in place and happening right now. And again, what we spoke about earlier about the fact that with war, it's a great way to take property and steal things from people. But the reality of the situation is there's more damage being done in a financial war around the world against each other by devaluing currency. And most of the people that we know in, the US, Canada, Europe, the UK, their money right now is a telltale sign. Everyone's saying, oh, I can't believe the price of everything. The food's going up, fuel's going up, everything is getting more expensive, my mortgage, whatever it is they're paying. Now, what they don't realize is it's not going up in price. It's the value of their currency that is being lowered. And with the likes of gold and silver, if people just took their money now and put it into gold and silver, this is the best hedge they can put against this system to stop them losing the value of these worthless paper notes or the digits that are on a screen within their bank accounts. And I really can't understand why more people aren't doing this as a long-term hedge. Is this something that you would recommend people to do as well?
Yeah, well, I've been talking about this for a long time, so I've certainly, made a lot of discussion around why I think it's so important to protect your wealth. And if you truly understand what's happening, and I've actually got a great book to recommend to people here. It's called The War on Gold by Anthony C. Sutton. Fantastic book. But you have to understand what gold is. You have to understand why it's money. Otherwise, people see it in the wrong light. They see it as an investment or
Yeah,
as a commodity or as a tradable asset. But what they don't see it as is actual money. But once that paradigm shifts and you understand, oh, this has always been money. We have always used gold as money. And you can go back to pretty much any time in history and see that gold was money. It's only in the modern era where we took it out of the system. And yet, since 2008, well, about 2009, what we have seen is consistently nations of the East have been stockpiling on gold. In 2009, China started to tell their citizens once more, buy gold. We want you to buy it. That's not happening in the West. They don't want you to know about gold, think about it. There's a war on gold in the West, but not in the East because they're setting up for the end of this system, and they don't want a war, a physical war. Like, I don't think that's what they are looking for. They actually, if you go back to 2009, there was a paper by the central banker in China, the head of the central bank, and it was called Reforming the Global Reserve Currency or Reforming the International Monetary System. I think that was it. And in that, he basically said, listen, these debt pyramids are going to fail. And it's in everyone's interest that we have some kind of new system that's going to be based on a money that is not tied to any one nation, that can be weaponized, hint, hint, the dollar.
yeah,
And that money is going to have physical intrinsic value because otherwise we're just going to build these debt pyramids again. Now, of course, that never happened. There was no reform. So China said, well, okay, well, we'll just get ready for the end of this one. That's all we can do. And since that time, they went on to become the biggest importer of gold on planet Earth. It wasn't before, but they
mhm,
did. The biggest miner of gold on Earth. It used to be Australia before that, and it was South Africa before that. But then it was China. So they started mining as much. And also the biggest domestic consumer because they started to promote it to their citizens. Buy as much gold as you can. That's setting up for the end of the system.
yeah,
That is setting up for a monetary reset. Now, what have we seen over the past 3 years? We've seen record gold buying by central banks across Europe. It's not just in the East, it's not just the so-called enemy nations. It's also in Europe to friendly nations. They're getting ready for the end game. They know something's coming. So, Czech Republic have increased their gold holdings about 400%. Hungary, Poland. It's only really Canada, Great Britain and the US who are not buying gold. And they're actually trying to get people to buy what? To buy stocks, shares, financialized assets again, anything that props up that Ponzi system to keep it alive. And of
yeah,
course, buying gold at this point is seen as a threat to that system. It really is. If you buy gold, what are you doing? You're taking your money out of financialized assets and putting it into an asset that is not going to add to that Ponzi system. So you actually damage that system by doing it. So therefore, there are moral and ethical reasons to probably buy gold as well, but that's not why you buy it. You buy it to protect your wealth from the potential financial collapse. And maybe it doesn't come. Well, okay, it doesn't come, Chris. It's performed pretty well over the last 50 years. It's performed 11 to 12% in every currency. So
yeah.
therefore, it's outperformed the stock market for 50 years. So even if you just had it as an investment, it works. But I think there's other reasons as well to explore around counterparty. I'd have a look at those reasons too.
And I can't express enough that people understand the difference between physically owning silver and gold as opposed to having stocks in gold or even mining stocks in gold. You know, the best way to protect yourself is to physically own this. And I think telltale sign, again, we'll go back to China, but probably the biggest telltale sign we're seeing right now is thousands of Chinese citizens queuing up to buy gold and silver out of their suppliers in the country. And I've seen videos and photographs of these huge lineups where people now are trying to convert their cash into gold or silver. And that to me is an absolute telltale sign. They're aware in that country of what's coming. This is why we're seeing gold go up right now, and silver is following exactly the same pattern in regards to its peaks. So what people should realize now is this is something that they should get themselves into as an asset get out of the cash, hedge what you've got, secure your future in that regards. I mean, the reality of the situation, unfortunately, is that people really do own nothing, whether they like it or not. And this is probably down to the fact that people are unaware of the situations. They're not educated in this, they're not told, they probably don't even listen to this show. And the moment the likes of me and you pop up on a social media feed, they're just going to dismiss what we're going to say because, these clowns are out again, they're probably saying. But as gold and silver have been the main key thing that we've discussed in regards to the asset protection here, what would be the smart move for people other than that to secure their assets? Is there any other vehicles or tangible assets that they can use to secure what they are possibly going to lose? We know that people are going to lose it within the next 12 months, I would say.
Yeah, well, I'm not somebody who is a complete fatalist on everything in that, you should just buy gold and live in a bunker kind of attitude. I don't think that's helpful. And, I'm an investor and I also coach investors, and we have a private investment group. So everyone who's been through my coaching, we actually invest together and we find really low risk, high return opportunities in the stock market. However, it's all about risk management, Chris. And even if you went 100% into gold, there is hidden risks there. You are taking on risk as well, because whenever you're 100% in anything, that to me is an extreme position. Now, I'm not saying it couldn't be useful, but there are other risks. Let's say, for example, they go for a confiscation. Then all of a sudden you can't use that gold. And now you are completely trapped in a position which you may be happy to be in because maybe the outside financial system is burning to pieces. And you're like, God, thank God, I've got something to protect me. But if you can't transact in it, then you're in trouble. So you have to diversify your risk as well. You have to have strategies in play that can work for all scenarios. And sometimes in difficult or really risky times, you have a portfolio that is very much skewed towards physical assets. And I would say gold should be the foundation of any wealth preservation strategy. That should be your base.
Yeah.
And that's what I've been doing for the past, that's what I've been doing for the past, let's say 5-6 years. As the system becomes more and more risky, I take on less risk. But once you've got a good base and that's performing for you, like if you've been in gold, let's say for the past 5 years in the British pound, you're up, I don't know, 110%, 115%. So you've doubled your money in a very short space of time. And then on top of that, you can have a portion that's there for speculation. And that can be maybe 10 to 20% that you strategically allocate to the stock market at times when the risk is low and there's a lot of liquidity. Because you could have done this in 2009. You could have said, oh, here we go, quantitative easing, let's go into gold.
Yeah.
You put, I don't know, let's say you bought yourself 20 ounces of gold. Fast forward 15 years, you've still got 20 ounces of gold. But somebody who had a more strategic portfolio where there was maybe allocated 50, 60, 70% in physical gold, but they still had a performing element where they was using that for speculative purposes with strategy, in a risk managed way. Well, that person could have gone from 20 ounces of gold to 200 ounces of gold in the same time.
Yeah.
And even if they ended up getting taken out in their equities position, in the end game, they've already more than covered that in the gains they've gotten.
Yeah.
So even during the last year, for example, last year, I was in the stock market for 4 weeks total. That's it. 4 weeks exposure to the risk. And 2 of those positions out of 3 were closed after a week. Literally. I got my 30% in a week and thought, okay, I'm taking that because the risk was high. So therefore, I didn't want to be in a position forever. And I would say this isn't a buy and hold environment. You don't want to be in the stock market with a time frame of, let's say, 5 years, 10 years. That's how people used to invest in value investing. But I still think there's plenty of opportunities out there. For example, in the junior and mid-tier miners, those things can pop 50, 60% overnight. In February, my investing newsletter, I told my clients, if you want allocations in the stock market, the miners are at the lowest risk, highest potential reward situation than they've been in years. Now is the time. If you want exposure, and it doesn't have to be a lot, Chris, it could be 10%. It could be 10% of your investable wealth, a tiny drop in the ocean. So long as you've got that physical backing, you'll be fine. Those positions are all up 75, 65% now in the space of a month. You could take your money out now and buy double the amount of gold you could have bought with that position a month ago. And that's more than paid for any risk that you take on for the next 2 years. Those are the things that I would say to people. You've got to be strategic, though. You can't just be allocating willy-nilly to the stock market and saying, I'm going to have 50% of my wealth in the... No. Like, you have to have a really good physical foundation and build on top of that your speculative elements. And if you can't do that, or you're not willing to learn that, then yeah, go to something very simple strategy, and make sure you do that in the right vehicle. If you're trying to do it, I would say even with vaulted bullion, there's a lot of programs out there. But again,
Yeah.
you know, Chris, if I've got a vault and you put your gold with me, I've got the gold, buddy. And when it comes time for you to cash out, what's going to happen? What if I say no?
Yeah.
You can't stop me. I've got the vault. I've locked the door, buddy. You're not coming in. What you would then do is go to a court of law and try and assert what? Your contractual claim for the gold.
Yeah.
You had a contractual claim. You never owned any gold, Chris. I owned the gold. You had a contractual claim. And it's very important people get that through their head when they're thinking about investments. What do I own and what's a contractual claim? And ultimately, like I said, there's plenty of ways to play this one. And I'm not saying I'm the only, I'm not saying I've got all the answers, but I would be much more heavily skewed to physical assets, irrespective of all this, because, you know, people can make an argument against any case. They'll say, yeah, but what about? And you're like, listen, we're working with a flawed system in a flawed world. We can only do our best. So I would say owning some farmland, owning some property is still a fantastic idea.
Yeah.
If they try and come and take everyone's land off them, then you've got a completely different set of problems anyways, because the world's falling apart. And I think you're going to need land. You're going to need land to grow your food. You're going to need land to fall back upon on hard times if you cannot get the necessities. You know, if we go back to World War II, we had victory gardens. If we have a food shock, if we have a third world war, what's the chances we're going to be getting all those food imports? What's the chances we're going to be getting all those products that are filled with semiconductors and Chinese components and rare earth metals that none of the West even have? Yeah. I'd say slim to none. So these are the things you need to think about: increasing your wealth, protecting your wealth. Well, you know, protect it first. If you can increase it, then great. Get some good mentors and advice. Listen to smart people. Listen to Chris. Find out what other people are doing. Don't listen to the speculators who are telling you you're going to get 1,000%, 10,000%, or get rich off Pepe coin, because those people are charlatans and you're taking on way more risk than you should be right now. It should be low risk strategies. And also think about those fundamental needs. If this really does go pear-shaped, and it might sound like an extreme take, but look around, Chris. Have you ever seen the world more chaotic? Have you ever seen the world more chaotic? I've never seen it, and I don't think many people have. So you really do have to think about those fundamental needs. Like, if this goes south, if my whole country goes south, like if I'm in a country and it really gets too hot to handle here, what do I do? Where am I going to go? How do I feed myself? If the local Sainsbury's doesn't open its doors to me, or they say you can only buy 2 tubs of bug meat or whatever the hell it is they're pushing. So those are the things that I think about. And maybe I'm a strange guy, Chris. Maybe I'm strange for thinking this way. But guess what, buddy? I've been doing it for about 8 years now. And my life's only got better, more free and more independent from doing that. And real wealth to me is time. That's not money, it's time.
Yeah.
You have money to protect your time so that you can do it, spending time with you, spending time with other people that I want to speak to, so I'm not forced to live in a world that I don't agree with. And, you know, I'd say also, yeah, business-wise, you have to start thinking about maybe having some other outlet for you financially, because a lot of jobs are going to go in the next 10 years. If we have a Great Depression, for example, job losses are skyrocketing now, Chris. So if you're in a sector that's vulnerable to that, now's the time to prepare. It's not when you get your P45, as we say in the UK, and you sat there unemployed, and you're one of those people that's got, 2 months salary in the bank. It's not going to be good enough. You know, it's not going to be good enough.
AI isn't stopping. AI is going full steam ahead. And most people, you know, we're seeing absolute ridiculous numbers on job losses now. People are losing their jobs. But AI,
add 10 years to that, Chris, it'll be infinitely more.
Yeah, and that's it. You know, and unfortunately, that's the position we're in. And when we were talking about assets and things, and you talking about land to grow on, you know, one of the things that I've done personally myself, and I would recommend that people do the same, is make sure you've got a storage of seeds. You know, if you have a box full of heirloom seeds that can grow your food, then you've not only got something that can feed you and your family, but you've also got something in the event of the situation which we think is going to unfold. You have a tradable good. You're able to have something there that, I can trade some carrot seeds for maybe somebody that's made some bread, or somebody who's grown something, or gasoline, whatever, petrol as we call it in England. But people need to start thinking as well, if they're going to pull the money out, and we're well aware that at some stage they're going to try and make money obsolete and bring it into a digital currency, people may as well now start hedging against that in regards to tradable goods. And I think buying things like seeds, long-term storable food, even tradable goods like cigarettes and alcohol, because in times of need, people are going to need their vices. People are still going to want to have, a drink of vodka or a beer or whatever it is, or smoke a cigarette, because the things that are very important to people in their lives are going to be gone or scarce. And right now, to protect yourself and have them, set aside as a tradable commodity moving forward is probably a very wise decision. Would you agree with that?
I'd say it's wiser. I'd say it's extremely wise and probably more important than anything else. If you look back throughout history, gold's not really much use in a crisis. What it is, it's a wealth preserver that you can see yourself from the end of one monetary system through to the next. And that's how it was always historically done. If you go to France from 1789 to 1776, sorry, 1789 to 1796, where they had the hyperinflation with the assignats, there was a time during that where they said, if you use gold, you will be killed. Chris, it got so bad that they said, if you go to a shop and you ask, am I paying in gold or am I paying in paper? You will be killed for asking, because of course they said the paper is as good as gold and nobody can question the paper. The paper's fine. There's nothing wrong. Don't look anywhere, even though it was hyperinflating. So there was no, so it was no use to you using it. But what it did do was allow you to survive that and come back around so that you didn't end that period of history completely stripped of your wealth.
Yeah.
So in those moments where you've got whatever happening outdoors and you don't know how bad it's going to get, what you're actually going to need is barterable and tradable items. And I would say, if you look back through any period of history, it comes back down to the necessities. And also, like you said, if there's things that people can no longer get, like I know, for example, my father-in-law, during the Polish hyperinflation, he used to go to Germany and he'd get motorcycle helmets and smuggle them back on the train to Poland.
Yeah.
Because there was no motorcycle helmets. There just was no production in the country of certain items. And you could only get them in, remember, it was the Soviet Union and the Iron Curtain. So anywhere that wasn't Russia, and I would say even Russia itself, the citizens were just left to rot. It was provide as much food for Russia to export to the West. And that's what was happening.
Yeah.
And the collapse of an empire is not a pretty sight. And what they used to do, like I said, was smuggle back goods from Germany across the border so they could barter and trade with them. And, that's how people would do it. And I was actually doing a podcast last night for my show. I've got my Parallel Systems broadcast. I don't know if you know, Chris, but I do a podcast as well called the Parallel Mike Podcast. And I was doing an episode all about inflation. And I was actually speaking with somebody who lived through that hyperinflation, who was actually there during the Polish hyperinflation. And we was talking about some of the stories. And she discussed how, you had to have a token to go get stuff from the shop. It wasn't even just the money. Now you was being rationed with tokens as well. So you couldn't even just use your hyperinflating money. And she said she remembered that when she was a child, she'd go to the store one week and she'd have some notes in the token and she was able to get a sweet. There was like one sweet in the whole shop, one type, and she could get it. And the next week she'd go back and the same amount of stuff, the same amount of token and notes was, the woman laughed at her. She actually laughed her out of the shop. She said, sorry, little girl, you can't buy that because it was hyperinflating so fast. Yeah. And I know my father-in-law as well here in Poland, he once queued for 2 weeks because people don't realize what happens in a hyperinflation. Queuing becomes the norm. Like people would get up at 1 a.m. to go start queuing to buy food at 7 a.m. when the shops open. So women would be out at 1 a.m. getting ready to queue. And what my father-in-law did, And everyone, he said, did this. You'd walk around with your entire life savings in your back pocket, desperately looking for something to buy so you could get out of this currency because you knew that in 2 days or 1 week's time, it would buy you less.
Yeah.
And that's the end
Which is
game
what we're
stage
seeing,
where you get to.
seeing that now. You know,
Oh, yeah. We're in
yeah.
the early stages of that now. And he actually queued for 2 weeks because what would happen is if you saw a queue, you'd say, well, I'm just going to stand in the queue in the hope that I can transfer out of this currency. And when he was in the queue, he was like, well, what are we queuing for? That's how it would work. You'd just get in it and then you'd ask questions. And it was like, oh, the guy's going to get some washing machines potentially. And nobody knew how long it was going to be or if they'd even turn up. But he stood in that queue for 2 weeks. He did a 12-hour shift and his cousin did the other 12 hours. He'd go off to work, then he'd sleep, then he'd come back and do his 12-hour shift and then vice versa. So there was alternating.
Wow.
2 weeks, he did buy the washing machine at the end of it. So he got rid of some of that currency. However, when he got to the front of it, and this is the most tragic part, is he found out there was going to potentially be some more goods coming in another 2 weeks. So he literally went all the way to the back of the queue and did the whole thing again. Now, you just think about how a society functions like that, Chris. It is the most inefficient system, and you basically crumble because nobody can be productive anymore. You know, right now, you go to the shop, you can get your goods in the space of 10 minutes. You go get it, you go to the till, and it's gone. In this society, in the future society where the currencies are collapsing, getting your goods can take 2 weeks, 3 weeks. Everything's rationed, everything's on a list, and you have to have approval for everything. That's why they bring in the tokens. And when did we see this? Do you remember during the last few years where there was, I don't know if you was in the UK at the time, but there was only 3 items, only 3 essential items.
Yeah, so
queuing up outside, waiting to be told when you can go in, following a system. Now, if that's not preconditioning for a hyperinflation, I don't know what is.
Yeah,
it's literally exactly the same. It's getting people ready for it. Now, you can take the warnings from history, or you can wait and see what happens. But yeah, I like to trust the cycles and the history rather than the governments. And I think they've got a pretty crappy record. So I know where I'm going on this one. And yeah, that's all I'd say is, you know, people don't realize just how hard it can get. But when you do speak to people who lived through those times, it hits home. This was in the 1990s. It wasn't a million years ago, you know?
Yeah. And that's it. And this is why I'm a big, fan of making sure that people are aware of having long-term storable food available to them. Put it away, forget you've even got it, because when you need it and it's not available anywhere else, you're ahead of the curve at that point. But let's get back onto property rights again, because that's what we were going to discuss today. Let's talk about intellectual property rights, such as patents. They are not as protected as we believe they are they?
You know, I don't think today they are, Chris. I think they used to be much more robust, but I don't think today they are. I'm certainly no expert on patents at all. Like, it's not an area that I've even studied. But I do know from growing up, my granddad, he was an inventor, an amateur inventor, and he told me about a few times when he had inventions accepted from him. So, he had somebody go patent something that he designed. And but I think today it's probably much even worse than that. I think today, when you look at industry and how it works, especially commercial industry, basically you either get approval from government contractors and defense contractors and a cabal who control industry, and then you can be the inventor. Then you get to be the Elon Musk or the Jeff Bezos. But those guys are selected, right? These people are selected to play that role, and they get given all of the fame. But essentially, what are they? They're just lackeys. I don't think they're the true inventors. And you look back throughout history, it was the same. Look at Edison, look at Tesla and having his property rights accept. And it's the same in the oil industry. People just consolidated, and there's always espionage going on in the background to try and accept people's rights or intellectual property. So yeah, I think today, I mean, I don't know much about it, but I imagine it's all the same stuff, because we don't live in a utopia. We're human beings, and there's greed. There's people out there who are willing to do worse things than you are. So you think, oh, I'm going to get treated fairly in this world, and maybe you don't. Maybe you come across somebody who doesn't care about your rights or your intellectual rights.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Now, one of the things, again, if you're lucky enough to be an entrepreneur and you set a business up and your business is doing well, and I'm not 100% certain whether this is the case, but it certainly seems feasible and plausible that this could happen. when it comes to business and you set your business up, the one thing that is demanded of you is business registration. And we are back to that word of registration again. And this has to be done in the UK with the likes of Companies House, who are a government of the body. Do you think if you own a business and your business is registered, that those businesses are also at risk as a property right should they wish to claim those business under that registration?
I've never thought about it. Never thought about that. I never thought about whether you could. I mean, is a business a property or is it something that I guess it depends on how you see it. You could have a legal title. So you could have a legal title in terms of you've registered a business and then you have property associated with the business, like a business address, and you have assets that you would apply to the business. But the business itself, I'm not sure if you could even say it's property. And in terms of registering it, there is a reason for registration too. It does give you rights. If you are, say, in the UK and you register a business and you become a limited company, there are perks and benefits that come with that. That's the point of registration, is you do get benefits.
Yeah.
And, in the UK, for example, if you have a limited company, then you have debts in your limited company. And if you go bust, you're not liable for it. The company is. It becomes a legal entity. That's why people register businesses, that then becomes a legal person. When we talk about us being a legal person, that's what a corporation is. It's a legal person, and therefore it can have debts ascribed to it. And it can take loans out in the business's name, and it can go bankrupt. It can be the business that's bankrupt without having liability for the human beings that actually run those businesses. So there are certainly good reasons to have businesses and registration on all those things. But in terms of, could it be a SEPT? I think, some of these things are just so abstract that, I don't know. I honestly don't know. I mean, I wouldn't put anything past the system that's dying. Dying system's like a drowning man. It can pull anyone and everyone down with it.
Yeah. Now, are you aware of where the expression that possession is 9/10 of the law comes from? And is this strictly true?
Yeah, it's true. It's a maxim. It's a legal, a lawful maxim. Most of law is based on maxims, right? It's based on simple truths that are observable in nature, natural law. At the end of the day, if somebody has something in their possession, doesn't matter if someone's got a legal title claiming ownership, they have to get it off them. And then how are you going to do that? You'll have to take them to court. And even then, if the court says you've got to give it back, what if they say, oh, well, I don't have it? That possession is 9/10 of the law for sure.
Yeah.
And that's why, there's lots of things in the world that people have legal claims to. There's lots of jewels and diamonds and all kinds of things that were taken from India and South Africa, like the Cunningham diamond. And, people have legal claims to it for sure, but they ain't getting it back because possession is 9/10 of the law. If you look at Venezuela, when they asked for their gold back from the Bank of England vaults, it was their gold originally, but they sent it across, and possession is 9/10 of the law. It's always the case. If you go back to World War II, when the Czech Republic was invaded, they'd kept their gold at the Bank of England for safekeeping because they knew the Germans were going to invade them.
Yeah.
And what happened is, once they got invaded, Hitler called up the Bank of England through his guy, the head of the Reichsbank, which was Hjalmar Schacht, and he said, we want the gold now. And now, of course, if you put it with the Bank of England for safekeeping, it was so they couldn't loot you. But the Bank of England transferred it across to him anyways. They had possession. They got to choose what to do. That was how he funded the invasion of Poland. So makes sense of that history.
I know. Now, are there any other things that you can think of that people think they own, but in reality could be taken at any time?
I'm trying to think, because it's an interesting question that they think they own that could be taken at any time. Well, listen, our life is probably the key one in that one, Chris. We all like to think we're going to live forever, but actually, no, I'd say our health. It's the things that we take for granted, and actually, those are the most important things that we have. Our family, our relationships, the people we love, our own health. Those are the things that we think we own, but actually, we don't. It's owned by Father Time. It's owned by our creator, whoever you want to put up there, but you don't have an infinite amount of time here. And that's why it's so important that we actually have perspective on everything in life. And, what's our goal here? Our goal is to thrive. It's to have relationships, meaningful relationships and experiences. You know, I watched a video on Twitter. It was one of those threads where it showed 10 videos of a guy asking people in their 60 to 90 age range. So people well over 60, you know, and he was asking them some simple questions. And, you know, these TikTok videos or these short videos are usually pretty tacky and crappy. This one was actually great because he was saying to them, you know, what would you ask your younger self? You know, what do you regret? Is there something that you miss? And every one of them, every single one of them said the same thing. They said, you know, I wish I never worked in pursuit of materialism, of stuff that I didn't need. I wish I spent more time with my loved ones. I wish I spent more time with my husband who passed away 2 years ago, with my parents who passed away a few years ago. Every single one of them said the same stuff. I wish I'd have done what I wanted to do when I was younger, like live on a boat and, you know, not spend so much time pursuing stuff that I didn't need, holidays, cars. Everyone was saying a warning about getting lost in materialism and losing sight of what's actually important and meaningful in life.
Yeah.
And, you know, when we talk about wealth, like when I talk about investing in those things, it's not to have more stuff. Like, I don't want more stuff. What I want is more time. I want more insulation from the threats
Quality.
of life. Yeah,
Yeah,
quality of life. I want to spend more time in nature, want more time with my wife and family. And, you know, having wealth is not my goal in life. It's not never been what I'm about or what I pursue. What I pursue is what's meaningful.
Yeah.
Of course, we also have to be aware that if we get wiped out financially or we become too indebted or we aren't sufficiently knowledgeable on finance to protect our wealth, then you could have a good 10, 15-year period where you're so struggling that you can't focus on what matters. And that is what we're trying to stop happening. So I would say, yeah, if there is something else that can be taken from you at any time, it's people and it's ourselves and it's our health. So, you know, always have that perspective in life. And shows like this where we're talking like this, you know, I'd say don't take a fearful message from this one, actually, because I certainly don't live in fear. And I think if you do feel anxious about the future, it's probably just because you feel subconsciously inside there's something else I should be doing. So go do that and then put it to bed, because we can only control the controllables. You can't change a legal system. You can't change the debt of a nation. You can't change, you know, fiat money or any of that stuff. You know, it's not going to go overnight. What's going to happen is a cycle. It's a cycle where we have good times and we have bad times. Okay, we might be going into bad times, but your times don't have to be as bad as everyone else's if you prepare. You know, if you make some preparations. And I would still say we live in extremely fortunate times. You know,
Yeah.
you woke up today, Chris, and you didn't spend 15 hours down a mine shaft.
No.
You know what I mean? Your children didn't have to go down a mine shaft age 2 to bring money into the house. You know, I mean, people like to see themselves as living through the worst times and as victims, but I actually don't believe that. I think we still live through very prosperous times and there's still a lot of opportunity. Yes, it could get worse. That could always happen. And yes, it may be challenging, but ultimately, I wouldn't trade my life for my great grandfather's, you know, he was 15 and he went to World War One, you know, as a 15-year-old. And then he went to World War Two in his 40s. And he fought 2 world wars. And in between, he had the Great Depression and the Spanish flu. You know what I mean? So I'm still pretty happy with what we've got in the West. We have been very fortunate, and we should always remember that. And yeah, and ultimately, that's a hopeful message. Find community, you know, find people that see what's going on too. That's going to be key. You know, we've got a private system, parallel systems community, people all across the world. We're all getting ready in our own ways. And, you know, some of these discussions are quite personal discussions about, yeah, how are you coping? How are you doing? You know, are you okay? And we can help each other out. You might need that support going forward because maybe you can't find that in your real world communities, as we all found in the last few years. Like, not everyone's going to be on board with getting ready for the future. Not everyone's going to want to have these discussions. So sometimes you need an outlet. But I'd say there's a lot to be hopeful for as well. It's not going to be half as bad as people think, so long as they're ready for it.
Yeah. The World Economic Forum, though, have clearly stated that we will own nothing and we'll like it or we'll be happy, whatever the saying was. Now, considering the leverage that they hold on governments all the world around, they've infiltrated everything to put the young global leaders into place. The leverage they hold, do you think it's possible that they are deliberately setting up for the likes of the huge corporations of BlackRock and Vanguard to own everything, where we have the great taking happening and they take our money, they take our property, they take everything that we own, somebody at that point has to own that. Is it likely that this is going to be given to the huge corporations that are already in place, and we will either have to become into a debt system where we rent back what we originally owned in order to survive? And do you think it could be the likes of BlackRock and Vanguard, who are the big players in the monopoly, in the pyramid of ownership of goods, companies, and everything out there, that would be the ones that would take this on board?
You know, when it comes to BlackRock and Vanguard, there's a lot of people who are very confused when it comes to describing them, because what they say is that they own everything. And it's like, yeah, it's not actually true. They don't own everything. They are the biggest holder of assets, but the assets are not registered in their name. They're registered in the name of the DTCC and Seed and Co. They're just the broker. So they get to assert the control. I mean, they're the ones who have, they're next in the chain for those assets. So you know, when people say, oh, BlackRock owns the world, it's like, no, they have all of the shares going through them, but it's not actually owned by them. It's owned by the DTCC anyways, you know, which is a centralized system. So I don't think BlackRock is the thing to fear here. And I don't think Vanguard are. They are just investment brokerage firms that just so happen to be the two biggest and most popular in the world. And I think people have to be careful not to get drawn into unnecessary conspiracy. I listen, I don't like BlackRock and I think they're a dangerous company. Make no mistake. However, I just think centralization is always going to happen. It's what happened in every industry, whether it's oil, whether it was electricity grids across the world, whether it's telecommunications. You know, in the US, they had, I think it was Bell, and they had to split it up. Right now, we've got it in tech and AI. We've got centralization happening constantly. And that is unfortunately just the way that a system works. You know, we talk about free capitalism. However, if everything's always free, the people who have the most money have the most power. And it's
Yeah,
not a utopian system. So you're always going to have people behind the scenes manipulating it so they get more power and more share of an industry until there's only just two or three big players.
yeah,
So could that happen with everything like our personal assets? Absolutely. You know, BlackRock are buying up all of the homes. That is
yeah,
why they're dangerous, you know, because they can do that. And that's why I think there should be systems in place to not allow these things. You know, there should be systems out there where we actually regulate these industries in such a way that they can own all the assets and that property rights are protected for the individual. You know, like the country that I live in, when they joined the EU, they were the only country that I know of in the EU that actually put stipulations on their farmland so that other corporate entities outside of the country couldn't come in and buy up all the farmland from the little farmers, because they wanted to protect the small farmers here. Because what happened in every other country is once you joined the EU, that meant that all of your property, land, and businesses could be bought from other European entities because, of course, we're all in it together. But then what would happen is you'd get all of these big companies like a BlackRock that come in and they just say, oh, great, well, you've got a really weak currency. We've got some dollars. Your farmland's priced at 20 times less what it would be in the US. They'd be licking the lips and they just buy it
yeah,
all up. You know,
yeah,
they just buy it all up, and then you'd have farmland prices going to levels where no farmer, no individual farmer could ever afford it. You know, like Holland, for example, the farmland over there is the most expensive in Europe, and land in Great Britain's pretty close.
yeah,
But over here, it is actually still affordable. If you was a young person, you know, if you was say, I don't know, let's say you're 25 and you thought, listen, I like what Mike's saying, I like what Chris is saying, I do see the future's going to be harder. I want to prop it with a little bit of land. You could do that. You know, you could afford to do that. You could buy yourself a nice farm in a nice place, in a nice village. And just as an example, I was driving through the local village, not far from where I am recently, and I noticed one of the houses was sold. It was up for sale and it sold, and it was a young couple that had moved in, probably a little bit younger than me, had a baby. And, you know, as you're driving by, you're seeing how people are developing. And they've got a nice little plot of land around the house, and you can see the gardens. And one of the first things that they did was start to build raised beds and start to get them ready, self-ready for growing, because it's so ingrained in the culture here. And because we've got that legacy of individual farmers, because their parents will have been farmers. You know, my wife's parents were farmers. Everyone was a farmer, or at least they was at some point, because it's an agricultural country. And
yeah,
that's because they protected the property rights of farmers. So that is what can happen if you've got a state who actually works in the interests of the citizens. Doesn't mean it's going to be perfect, but it can be much better. And it can stop things like BlackRock coming along and buying everything up. And I think, that is how you'd want a state to be, because we're not going to get rid of them overnight. But what we can do is hopefully find a place in the world where we have some degree of protection. But I would say if you are in certain places and you're seeing the trajectory and it's going towards a great reset type situation, and you're seeing them implement a lot of these strategies that seem to be trying to take you away from ownership. And I would say the UK is really at risk. I mean, they are trying to get rid of all farmers now. They're actually even offering them lump sums of cash to get off the land.
Doing the same in Canada. The restricting what people can grow. They're increasing the taxes for those that are there. We've seen this coming a mile off. We have the farm in Canada, and obviously once things started to change over the past few years, certainly, and the likes of UNDRIP coming in, where the United Nations are coming in and they're starting to parcel up the land. And we've also got the governments of the world, giving the likes of the United Nations land on a massive scale under the UNESCO heritage sites. It was pretty obvious which way things were going, and it's not got any better since we left. They've continued to put in more laws, more legislation, especially with this carbon tax that they've brought out there, which is utterly ridiculous. But again, if you own a farm, they're asking that you pay more tax. And, when we were talking about property rights and what people really think they own, even if somebody owns a farm outright in Canada right now, the likelihood is with the taxation system that the government's putting in place, they can tax you to the point where you can no longer afford to pay the taxes, and they will just come along and take that land from you. And I do think in the back of my mind that that is very likely the plan moving forward within Canada. And if the rules don't change and if people don't start getting things moving in a different direction, they are seriously at risk of losing their land and property in that country. And again, we already know that it's Crown land, the majority. So, people really need to be aware of what risks there are in regards to that, and make sure that when they do buy something and they do buy land to grow on and have a farm, that it is somewhat secure to a certain extent. I don't think anything can be 100% secure wherever you go, but certainly be less risk from the vultures out there that are wanting to take the land away from people so that they do own nothing and apparently be happy.
Yeah, I think that's what it's about. It's about putting yourself in a place where you're going to have insulation from those agendas, because ultimately they are going to continue. They're not going to stop. And there are places in the world that will be better to try and create a life than maybe some of the more decadent Western nations where it seems to me most of this is located. I chose a place where it was all farmers, where the majority of the country is farming. So you're not going to get them. You're not going to get the entire country's land. You can't out-tax them because there's too many. But if you go to a country where it's hobby farms and there's only a few people doing it, then yeah, you don't have much of a backup. But the other day I was driving and they literally had blocked the entire country, the farmers, because they're protesting about these very things, because they're being told, CO2 emissions, you're going to have to leave 30% of your land fallow, taxing on different inputs that go in that are going up. So they literally stopped the entire country. So okay, you're not gonna get rid of those in a hurry. I mean, you can try, but it's going to take a long time to take land off people like that. It's going to have to be done systematically, and it's not going to be done overnight. And if you go back to the Soviet regime, that was where they failed in Poland. It was with the farmers. They couldn't control the farmers, so they just let them be. In a lot of the other countries, they got away with it. They took back the land, they collectivized it in Ukraine, but over here they couldn't. So they just said in the end, "Oh, knackers to you guys, just keep on farming." And they tried to make it seem like they were in control, but they knew they couldn't. And I think that's the people power part of it. There's always a people power element, and if there's too many of a certain type of person, and they're not going to be able to get those things through, well, that gives you a lot of insulation. So I would say pick your location wisely. And don't spend the next 30 years fighting a losing battle. Don't get me wrong. If you have to stay a place, you should always, you should fight in many ways. Okay, you should be outspoken and you should speak the truth, and but you do have to accept certain parts of this one, and acceptance is key. In life in general, that there are certain things you can't stop. It's out of your control, and arguing about it for the next 30 years. Maybe you would actually be better off just saying, okay, well, where can I make my vision of a future happen?
Yeah.
And that's the decisions you have to make now, because maybe you don't get to make them in 5, 10 years. And if that's the case, it could be too late. So I would
Yeah.
say take stock of where you are, what you want to do. And if you want to have something a little bit more natural, you want a homestead, which is hard work. It's really
Oh,
not,
yeah.
it's not easy. It's not like these things are easy. It's not like you get to sit outside all day and enjoy the fruits of your labor. No, you're working hard, but there's a trade-off, and maybe that trade-off is far better than what you had before. Sat 8 hours in a car driving around cities in rush hour, with smog and angry people and no community. And it's always in life about saying, what do I want versus what could have I had? We always kind of like dwell on we like to think the grass is greener. We don't think about the challenges of that new life. And when we're in that new life, we look back on the old one and forget all the negatives. So it's always a case of just understanding what it is you're about, what you want. And, maybe it's not for everyone. Maybe some people say, I'd rather be in the city and have exposure to whatever happens. Like if it falls apart, then okay, you accept that risk.
Yeah.
That's what I'd say.
One of the property issues that I see, and we're talking about pretty much imminent happening, is the fact that the digital currency system is already in place. This is something that's ready to go at the point that they choose to crash the current financial system and allow this to take over as a medium of what I see being control. I'm not 100% how this digital system is going to work, but the way that I see them possibly doing this is the fact that the digital system is created once everybody loses everything. The own nothing and be happy situation again. But once we lose everything, the digital system is going to be created not only as a control mechanism, but as a way of giving people just enough sustenance to stay alive and continue, whether that's buying food, the properties. If somebody else all of a sudden owns your house, you're going to be renting it back. Is it likely that the central banks, who are going to be the key players of this, because they know the old monetary system can no longer sustain itself? We mentioned that, and we're seeing that in the way of hyperinflation starting currently, with the cost of goods going up to the extent where it's becoming unaffordable for most people. But do you see possibly the way that I'm thinking now, that this digital currency is going to be loaned to people, where it's created, nobody has anything? So if you want to buy a car, if you want to buy food, if you want to buy anything, that you are taking a loan directly off the central banks that is payable back, possibly with interest or whatever it is. Is this going to be a digital control system?
Oh, undoubtedly, it will be a digital control system. I think that's a given. They are not going to go to something like that and make you freer with it. They're going to go to that and make your life much more restricted.
Yeah.
And they've already said there'll be limits on how much you can spend. There'll be limits on how much you can save. Just think about that for a second. Limits on how much you can save.
Mm.
Interesting concept, isn't it? Because that essentially will trap you at a strata of society. You'll never pull yourself out of your serfdom. That's the digital chains that you literally cannot save in the currency. And once all of the asset prices become out of your reach, maybe. I think ultimately what we're going to see, and these are the bits we can say for sure, is we're going to have a currency reset. We're going to have a reset of these currencies. They're going to purge the system of all of the fiat money because it's hyperinflating, and they can't continue into the next system with quadrillions in derivatives and an infinite amount of debt. And, there's no way to marry the two. So you've got a new system and you've got an old system. The old system will have to finish. And that could happen very quickly, of course. That can happen, overnight. It can happen in a very quick space of time. And they're constantly trying to stop that right now. When we had the pensions crisis in the UK, that was a trigger. The fuse was lit on the financial system because it's so interlinked. If that had gone off, that would have been it. The regional banking crisis in the US, that was another fuse that was lit. And they keep running and throwing water on that fuse and saying, we don't want it to get to where it inevitably has to go. So we know that's going to happen. And then, like you said, we're seeing them build out the infrastructure for a new system, the digital infrastructure. And I blame 100% cryptocurrencies and Bitcoin, all of the development in that space has completely been used to create the alternatives. And I know some people will say, yeah, well, that's why we've created it, to escape that. It was going to happen anyways. But, you know, think of the millions of hours of developers that have gone into those spaces thinking they was creating something for freedom. And actually, it's now being used as the model for our own chains. And that's what always happens. They're very clever at getting us to build our own prisons because they're not creative people. You know, they're not going to come up with all of these different ideas. Chris, they need us to believe that we're doing it for a good thing. And the same with NFTs, the same with tokenization. Like that is what they're implementing right now. If you go look across in countries like Ukraine, they're already doing, I think, 40% of all land transactions are now being done onto the blockchain, and they're tokenizing the land as it sells. Nice. So we're already there. You know, it's already happening, and I'm certainly not excited about that digital cryptography future. You know, I'm not down with that. I like the real world, and I like real things. I don't want to see Mona Lisa on a screen and be told, yeah, I own, I don't know, 1,000,000% of this painting that's in somebody's house somewhere else. I'd rather have the real stuff, Chris, in my house, even if it's not as good as, well, let's face it, the Mona Lisa's a crap painting. But yeah, I'd rather, yeah, you know what I mean? Like this whole idea of no, it's a digital representation of something that's in the ether. It's like, okay, well, you can go down that path. I'm going to stick to the real stuff. But ultimately, there are many ways to skin a cat. And if you believe in other aspects of that system, then okay. But I would always say what's created by man will unfortunately always be corrupted by man. And there's a million ways to corrupt all of these things because they control all of the infrastructure behind it. That's why the technological system is so appealing to them, because they can switch anything off. You know, they literally do have a screen in front of them where they can switch off a bank account, they can switch off an electricity a grid, or if it's your house and it's a smart house, they can turn off your lights, turn them back on. You know, they can stop your car with a kill switch. I mean, that is the ultimate control tool. It's a tyrant's wet dream. It's like, oh my God, I can literally turn Chris's laptop off right now because he's having a conversation I don't like. You know, brilliant. So yeah, like that is, of course, well, that's what they're gonna do. You know what I mean? No matter what they promise people, like you'd have to be absolutely dumb and naive. Well, not even naive. You'd have to be dumb. You'd have to be a fool to think that that future holds anything worth having for people who value their freedom. But of course, there will be people that fall into the trap and believe it, and so be it. But I would say, don't worry about what they say they're going to do. I'd say worry about what you're going to do to avoid it. That's the only solution here. You know, find people who agree with you. Find people who actually don't want to be a part of it. Okay, now we've got something going. You know, maybe you can live close by. Maybe you can start a little parallel system where you're actually trading between one another. Maybe someone's got some rabbits. Maybe somebody else has a cow. You know, that's the start of a new system. That's the start of money. And Chris, what do you think is going to happen when they create a CBD system? Like, do you think it's going to thrive? Do you think it's going to work? Or do you think they're going to trigger the biggest black market in human history as everyone realizes that they're now being taxed on gifts to their child for their birthday? You know, even like a $10 gift for your child, that's a digital currency you're getting taxed on. I think it's going to create the biggest black market in human history. And if that's the case, if a black market exists that is so prevalent that nobody wants to use that system, how does that system survive?
Yeah,
it needs life. It needs air to survive. It needs the lifeblood of human beings using it and wanting to use it. But the moment people realize what it is, it's over because it requires your participation. You know what I mean? It's like a marriage. You have to go there and sign the contract and say, I do. But if everyone says, I don't, it's not going to happen. So even if they get it up and running, it will fail catastrophically very quickly. And I would say prepare for failure, not for success, because it's the failure that's going to happen. But what does that look like? Well, it looks probably like the Soviet Empire after, well, the end of the Soviet Empire is probably what it looks like. And then what you'll see after that is the real system. You know, they might try and get that off the ground in the West, or maybe it doesn't happen at all. But there is a real system, and that is a gold-backed system. And that's why all of the central banks have been buying gold. That's why China's literally in the process of building out the currency with the BRICS community, where they're going to have a digital token, yes, but it's backed by real commodities. And there's copper, there's oil, there's everything in the basket. So all the nations that produce stuff can be a part of this because they don't have gold, but they do have, for example, where you are in Mexico, they've got a lot of copper, they've got a lot of silver. And they'll basically back their currencies with that. And as they trade with one another, they'll accumulate gold, because gold is the one thing that you don't need to use. It doesn't perish. You know, you can't back a currency with wheat for long, because your wheat's going to go off in a year's time. So you sell it to the market and you get gold in return. Gold is always the form of money that they're going to go back to. So at the point they go to that system, you know, you'll be very, very happy that you had some of that real money, because if you're China, Chris, and you've got 40,000 tons, and I'm like, let's say I'm Peru and I've got 300 tons, or let's say I'm Canada and I've got 0 tons, you've all got a vested interest on that gold being revalued. And it has to be revalued anyways, because all of the assets in the West are so overblown that as the fiat system collapses and the nominal value has to go down collapsing, the gold will continue to retain its purchasing power. So for that reason alone, you'll probably be able to buy 10 times more stuff than you could in the old system. But if they revalue it because they need to, because how's Czech Republic with 300 tons of gold going to pay for their oil, for their fuel, for their commodities from this new system if they don't have a much, much higher gold price? Because 300 tons would go like that in the new system if gold was valued at the old price, which has been manipulated down. So you'll see, in my opinion, there will be a huge revaluation of gold as well. Now, how that plays out for us, we don't know. Listen, we're just trying to do our best. But I would say, yeah, their CBD system, I don't give it any chance of succeeding. I think that's purely for the plebs and for the people who choose to put themselves in there. And I think a lot of people will opt out very quickly, and therefore it won't succeed. It'll fail.
I really do hope that's the case. But now back to, again, the property rights and back to patents. And this one is something I pulled out of all possibilities that we didn't cover earlier. We know that there are patents on vaccines, and they're in place right now. And with the current push for all the vaccines to be mRNA technology that alters human DNA, would such a modification to a consenting human being be possibly and unknowingly by the individual actually be giving their bodies as property to the patent holder?
Yeah, this has already been tested in a court of law, that if you add a synthetic strain of mRNA to a person, you have patent rights, ownership rights over that strain. It's the same as with GMO crops. If you have a GMO seed, doesn't matter if you plant that seed on your land, if that seed blows across, like you said, and it creates that genetically modified strain, you don't own the patent to that strain. So they have actually managed to get property rights and ownership over nature in that sense.
Yeah.
So you can have property rights over a human being because they are created by God, and God gives you ownership over who you are. You know, and that's why they create a legal system with, you know, we spoke earlier about why you have legal constructs. But if you add something synthetic, it has already been tested in a court of law. And I think the case was from 2012 that if you have a genetically modified organism or synthetic DNA and you add that to a person, of course, yeah, the court will give you patent rights over it, because you can, you know, it goes back to the start. If you can define it, if you can show evidence of the creation of it, then the creator can have property rights. So what that means for the future, and what that means for people who are willingly accepting synthetic, you know, DNA and transhumanism and all these different ideas, well, I don't know. You know, I'm not a legal expert, but it certainly doesn't sound good, does it?
No, to me, it's, you know, it's like you say with the GMO stuff and the fact that, you know, so much land has been taken. We saw it happening in India. You know, we've seen it happening around the world, and maybe that was the precursor to test the system for these mRNA things. And it does kind of bother me to that extent. Let's go back to crypto. Even though secured through the exchanges by the likes of blockchain, how safe is the ownership of digital currencies in regards to the rights to this property?
You know, I don't know. You know, it's not an area that I specialize in. It's certainly not one that I pay much attention to. But I think the problem with anything that's digital is the digital representations. There is always somebody out there who has far more knowledge over it than you. You know, if you look back at the history of cryptography, the people who make these cryptocurrencies are not the masters of cryptography. The masters of cryptography work for governments in agencies, and that's always been the case. if you go back 100 years and you look at, let's say, World War II, World War One, it was always a battle to be the best at cryptography. That's key. You can't win a war unless you can ensure that your plans are concealed. So cryptography is their forte. They have teams of the best minds, the best mathematicians, the best cryptographers from all across the world working for them 24/7. So if you think that you're going to create something that's not going to be backdoored or at some point broken, you're wrong. And the same with quantum computing. They're going to have mastery over that technology, I'd say 15, 20 years before the average consumer gets a sniff of that in their technology. That's just the way it's always been. You go back to the master shipbuilders and the banking oligarchies of the 1500s. They mastered the technology of the day long before anyone else because they understood that power comes from having mastery over technology.
Yeah.
So I'm not saying there aren't great minds out there, and I'm not saying there's not people who can't create great stuff, but I would just say, personally, I don't have the intellect and skill set to figure out those things in a way that would give me comfort to say that in 10 years it's not going to be broken, or in 10 years somebody else hasn't, or that it's not even backdoored to begin with. Because how would I know? Just because somebody else tells me it's not, just because everyone says, well, we've had it for 5 years, 10 years, Chris, we'd know by now. Well, actually, if you go back to World War II, after World War II, there was a company called Crypto AG, and they sold encryption devices to all of the world's intelligence agencies. This was a Swiss company. It was the biggest in the world.
Was that the Enigma machine that was part of that?
No, the Enigma machine was actually broken in World War. Was it World War II? The Enigma.
Yeah, World War II. Yeah.
World War II, and then they backdoored it and sold it to all of their allies after World War II. That's what happened because no one knew it had been broken.
No.
It was a secret. It was top secret. So then they had all these Enigma machines. So they backdoored them and sold them to all their allies so they could spy on the communication. But after that, there was Crypto AG. And Crypto AG made the encryption devices for the West during World War II. And it was a Swiss company. And then after World War II, they were the forerunner in encryption devices across the world. And they sold them to, I think it was something like 60, 70% of the world's intelligence agencies. And all the government cables, like 70% of all government cables were going through their machines in the 1980s. So this company was around for a long time. And this goes back to my point on, we'd know if it was broken, Mike. We'd know if it was backdoored. Crypto AG was a front for the CIA and then later the NSA. And every single machine that they produced was backdoored, and not a single intelligence agency ever found out. In fact, even to today, they still deny it, but it's commonly believed. Well, it's commonly known. Go online and look up Crypto AG, and you can read the story for yourself. And the whole time, every single cable, every single communication was being listened in on and decrypted, and they had a way to do it. Now, who created SHA-20? Is it SHA-22 that Bitcoin's based on? It was the NSA. Yeah. They created it. They created the protocol. And again, people will say, "Oh, you're getting it wrong. You don't know. Do your work, Mike. Do 200 hours." Listen, I'm not telling anyone what to do with their money, and I never would. I just say what I think, and I'm allowed an opinion too. And my opinion is, like, I don't know these technologies. I'm never going to be a master cryptographer. And I would say trust in something so complex and something that's so changeable. Technology moves so fast and they're so good at it. I mean, they've got such an advantage, Chris, when they've got teams of people working 24/7 on these things. I just say, well, I'm not going to trust that. That's my take on it. So whether you get property rights on it or not, it doesn't matter to me because, it's just not my space. And I think you can speculate on these things for sure. That's a different story. If you want to speculate and try and increase your wealth and you know how to speculate well, that's completely different. Go for it. Bitcoin's one of the best speculations in human history. I know some people who have earned their life's fortune on Bitcoin because they knew how to speculate. But they ain't talking about it saving the world. They ain't talking about it ending wars and saving humanity. They're talking about it as a speculation. And maybe I'm wrong. So maybe you want to own some Bitcoin in case it is the thing that works. Like, I can't say. I'm just giving you my opinion. So, don't shoot the messenger because, the golden cow has been touched.
No, and there's a lot of people that really want to defend themselves against Bitcoin and digital currencies. And I've seen the arguments online for and against. But, I've never really considered what you were saying then, and now I'm thinking about the Enigma machine, and I'm thinking about all these technologies that couldn't be broken over the years that either were broken or had a backdoor in them. We don't know who invented Bitcoin or has the backdoor to it. And likely it could be some nefarious company ready to do something in regards to that, to crash that system to bring about their own. But not only that, as you said, the advances in technology, somebody could invent something tomorrow, may already be invented now, we're not aware of it, that can go into these things and act as a virus, shut down your system, regardless of how secure blockchain is at the moment. And all of a sudden, people are going to wake up one day and something has attacked, taken, stolen, come in through the back door, and their digital currency is no longer accessible and it's gone. And that is a very, very distinct possibility for this digital system that's been created. In fact, I think it's probably more fragile than, having something as a tangible asset and solid and taking the risk of somebody coming and stealing it from you. Because, at least you've got a fighting chance at that point. with something that could be attacked through a back door, stolen, blocked, or infected somehow with a virus within these computer systems. There is a very great risk towards that, isn't there?
Yeah, well, we hear about every day a new bank, a new university, a new industry. In the US, commercial espionage from other nations is huge. Like, people don't realize just how often, and we're talking about systems that were created by the smartest minds in the world when it comes to cryptography, and online security, that are being broken day in, day out. If you have a quantum computer, and if the history of technology is always the same, they're about 20 years ahead behind closed doors. Like,
Yeah.
if you don't know that, then you don't know your history. It's simple. GPS was being used about 20 years before we ever found out about it. Every technology was the same. They were crossing the Atlantic hundreds of years before our history tells us it was possible, because
Yeah.
they always master a technology and then don't share it with people, because it's simple, right? If you want power over people, you don't allow them to have equal technology. You don't allow them to have equal property rights. You don't allow them to have equal forms of money. You stack the odds in your favor. And today I would say, looking at the space of people who love those assets, it's hopelessly naive. It's hopelessly naive of an understanding. Like, I don't claim to understand cryptography, but I understand the history of cryptography, and anyone can get up to speed on that. And when you do, your risk analysis changes. It changes from the YOLO, only live once, hodl, save the world, to actually, no, I'm going to be a little bit more regulated. I'm not going to believe that this is forever, and in 1,000 years we're still going to be using a technology in the, like, you hear this today, right? In 1,000 years we're still going to be using Bitcoin. Like, really? You think exponential growth in digital technology, we're going to be using an asset? Chris, it would be like saying that in 1990, that those old cars that went 10 miles an hour with the big crazy wheels on it, like, this is going to be here for 1,000 years, boys. Like, no, that's not the way life works. So I'm just trying to be rational and say, okay, where could I get something wrong? Like, if I went into this, could I lose here? And then I make a risk analysis. So when I look at these things, I look at them from a conservative point of view. And I would not say don't have these things. I would not say don't trust those things. It's up to you what you do. But I would say just don't believe the hype that people, well, I call them car salesmen, when they tell you this is going to do this is going to do that, you are going to be fine, there is no risk here. Yeah. I'm a student of investing history. I know every bubble that's ever existed. Every single one was preceded by the same talk. This time's different. This technology is going to change the world. And this asset will never go to zero because it's the best, it's the most premier. .com bubble, go back to the 1920s, the automobile bubble, go back to the 1850s, the railway bubble. Everyone had the same different dialogue. And all the time, there was people in the background who already had mastery over that technology. And they knew the history. They knew where it was going. So I'm just somebody who's risk averse. That's just my style, and always has been, and it served me well. And if you are going to have something where you don't fully know the ins and outs of it, and I'd say none of us can, because it's a complex world, then of course you build in insurance into that. If it does go wrong, you take action in your position sizing and your allocation to make sure that if it does go wrong, you'll be okay. It's not going to wipe you out. Are you more strategic when you buy it? Like, there's a lot of people who get rich because they buy it, but they also sell it. They sell it, like they sell it at the right time when they've got, and I actually recommend to people good buying opportunities when Bitcoin's low. Like the last time I recommended Bitcoin was at $20,000. Those people right now at 70 are up to 220, 230%. They're good. They can sell 50% of their position now. And 50% of their position, they've doubled the money almost. And they can leave the rest in to go. And if it goes to the moon, brilliant. But if not, they've got the money out and they've converted it to something else. Or they're going to buy back in when it dips down. So it's all strategy. And I just think there's a lot of people out there today who have no idea about risk management. And if this episode has done anything for anyone, I'm sure it's this, that is give them a good idea of hidden risk. Because there's always hidden risk, my friend, in investing and in life in general. And knowing those hidden risks is half the battle won, because then you naturally will be, oh, I need to think about this. I need to be a little bit more thoughtful in how I do X, Y, and Z, rather than just live unconsciously or believe narratives that are created for that exact reason. They're created to enrich somebody else or to provide benefit for others. But it's generally, Chris, not for our benefit. And we have to be people who take responsibility for our own analyses. And, I'm always happy to listen to other people's opinions on everything, and I accept them. Because guess what? I might be wrong. Chris, in 5 years, I might be wrong, and maybe they've all got mega yachts. And I hope they invite me over for a beer. Like I hope they take pity on me for getting this one wrong. They invite me over for a beer, and we can laugh at Mike for being wrong on it, and that's fine.
I'd rather be right about something that's wrong.
Well.
Yeah, talking about.
I'm happy. Like I'm happy to live more risk averse and to allow other people to be more speculative, because risk averse has been good for me, and I think you can get really good returns and not take on a lot of risk. And like I said, there are strategic ways to play any asset, including cryptos and the Bitcoin space. I actually first bought Bitcoin when it was $100, so I understand the space, but. Just because I don't believe in it as a long-term asset, it doesn't mean that I don't see it as a viable thing to own in a portfolio, because it can add firepower. You can have 5% in Bitcoin, and that could give you the kind of returns that would take decades to get elsewhere. How it favors in the long run is, I guess, the discussion that we're having here. It's not about whether it's a viable asset. And that is where I actually say, oh, well, I don't think the long run is going to be here in 20, 30 years in the same form. And I also think if it was truly that threatening to the system, I don't think we'd be talking about it now, Chris. I don't think we'd be sat here discussing it. I think they're probably more scared of assets that are unregistered, because with the blockchain, although it is anonymous technically, they've got control over the infrastructure. All of the miners are centralized these days. All of the exchanges are centralized these days. It's literally about one company that has controlling shares in about 50 of the top crypto exchanges. So it's all been centralized anyways behind the scenes. And if it was me and I had the option between a load of people going off grid and living decentralized and dealing only in physical stuff that I can't monitor, track, or trace, or having people with a wallet that can literally track every transaction, and all I then have to do is link it up to somebody, and I control the internet super highway, I control the electronic grid, I have backdoors in all of the Windows programs and everything else. I'd say, well, that's easy, that one. I control all that data. But what I don't control is nature, where people are out frolicking free and living in the forest. So, if I had to choose between the two for a future where I'm going to try and control people, I'd go that way. I'd go for the one where I've already got superior control and understanding over everything that's technological. And that's sadly the way it is, so make of that what you will. It's up to the individual to do their own analysis.
Absolutely. Back to risk. I sent you an email that I wanted to kind of run something by you and get an idea of where we are. And that is in relation to the fact that if we are aware that things are being put in place for a central bank digital currency, if we're aware that the cost of living is growing to the point where it's the start of hyperinflation, if we're aware that the property rights we thought we had don't exist because they belong to somebody else, and especially those who are well aware of the great taking, that we are at risk now of losing everything that we own unless we protect it. Now, what people are doing, and I was thinking, why are we waiting for those who are in power to create and drop the greatest wealth transfer known in history to mankind? This is their game. This is their play. They have full control over this. And right now, we're well aware that the central banks are pumping so much money into the markets. They're pumping so much money into the banking system in overnight lending just to keep things on life support. They have their finger on the switch, and they are waiting for where the time is convenient for them to flick that switch, to crash the system, and to create the greatest transfer in wealth ever known. It's going to make the Great Depression look like somebody dropped some loose change down the back of the sofa. What if we are the majority? And we are the majority. You know, we are billions of people around the world who are going to lose pretty much everything that we own. And if the World Economic Forums we mentioned earlier certainly have the agenda of us owning nothing, this is not something that they just put out there for a joke. This is something that they want to do. When we look at the idea of war and the fact that if somebody feels they are going to be attacked, the likelihood is that they will form a preemptive strike. Would it be viable for us as the potential victims of what is coming to actually turn the tables and crash the system ourselves? And to do this, I mean, people will take all their money out of the banks. There will be a run on the banks like we've seen before, and it will crash the banking system. People will take all of their IRAs, all their tax-free investments into the governments that they have, and pull them. And yet you're going to get taxed. And I do hear people saying, oh, well, I'll lose 15% of my investment on my 401k if I take the money out now. But you're going to lose everything if you don't. And this could go the same for stocks, shares, bonds, everything that people have. Because once this happens and they pull the switch at their timing, we're going to lose everything. But right now, the potential is there for people to take their money, take their stocks, take their investments, and pull that money out right now and put it into secure assets. So when the crash happens, which we will actually cause, people are at least having ownership of something that can't be taken from them. I would call this, and I thought maybe the hashtag of crashing the system could be put out there, you know, to crash the system, hashtag crash the system. And if it gained enough momentum and people realized that if they didn't get the money out now, that there's only limited funds within the bank, and once we crash the system, they will lose everything, that it will cause more people to actually run on the banks, pull their investments right now. And do you think this would give us, or a majority of us, the upper hand against the very system that wishes to take everything from us?
You know, I've never been asked that question. It's an interesting idea in terms of like, could it be possible? I'd guess that, you know, if someone tried to do that, they would stop it before it managed to get to the point where it created some kind of systemic crisis, because of course they can control buying and selling. They can freeze selling if they want. They can freeze withdrawals.
Yeah.
And I think ultimately, you know, to take that kind of action, you'd have to be aware of all of the consequences of your action to knowingly go into it on a moral level. Like, would it be a moral thing to do? Because there's no way you'd ever get consensus at all. Like, you can't, you know, get a message out to billions of people. So therefore, it's going to be some people. You know, some people could do it, and there are examples in investing history, like with GameStop, for example, where a small group of people who targeted their energy very directly towards a certain financial a set and keep out of the financial infrastructure or
Yeah.
a stock in this case, and
Being
doing
sold out.
something, yeah, where they actually did cause issues and they actually froze that stock. I remember I was watching it on the screen. Had my trading view up at that point and it froze it. And they said people can only sell only. They actually made it so all you can do is sell, you can't buy.
Yeah.
And therefore, people were trapped. So that'd be what happened if somebody did that anyways, I think, because that's why you would have such control over a system, is to ensure there wasn't somebody that could create such a systemic shock. Of course, there's many systemic shocks they can't control. Those are the ones that they don't know that are coming. So yeah, I think there's a moral issue there. Is firstly, like, what is the damage you're going to cause, and how is that damage going to manifest? Like, who's going to take the brunt of it? And then the other thing as well, I would say, is it would probably just play into the hands of the people who are responsible for the system coming down, because now they can say, well, you did it. Those guys, they are responsible for all of your financial hardship and pain. There was nothing wrong with the system, but they literally, look, there's a hashtag here. These guys went around and all decided to do this to you, and they're responsible. It's the far right, it's the right wing, it's the anti climate change people, it's the anti this people. That would be right up their street because they've got a monopoly, of course, on media and propaganda. So yes, I think it would probably fail for those reasons. And I'm not somebody who believes that we should be going up against a system in such a way. I'm somebody that actually believes the best way to live your life is to just create that future that you want for yourself and have other people do that too. So to create the kind of world that you want within your world, and then pair that with other people, and that will slowly, these systems always exist and totalitarianism always exists, but they do require people to participate. No system can grow without the public engaging with it. So, I guess that is a more holistic way of starving the system of oxygen, is just to do you do what's right for you. You go back to living how you want to live, then you don't have to contribute to, say, big industrial complexes, because it's not your life. You're living small and you've got a community and you're growing your own food and maybe you're engaging in natural health. And I think that's probably a more holistic way that doesn't have such a confrontational streak to it, which ultimately, like I said, I don't think it would work. I think it'd be weaponized against people. But that's just my take. Yeah, I've never been asked that question.
Yeah, no, and that's it. And we were well aware that the system in this way has been manipulated in the past. I mean, the whole reason the Rothschilds had such a stronghold on the financial systems globally is because they played a very similar trick in regards to the battles and getting the messenger back that England had or hadn't won the war at that point. And what they did, they deliberately started selling off their stock. It was like something out of the movie Trading Places, really, when you think about it. And, they monopolized the whole system by buying up all those stocks for pennies on the pound or cents on the dollar. And when it was realized that England had won the war, those stocks took off again. And they had already bought the panic at that point. So, somebody actually going in and deliberately causing something to happen that is financially beneficial is not unknown in human history. But at the end of the day, why should we allow them to do that to us again when the opportunity arises for us to actually do it to them and at least come out with something? But I do take on board the points that you've made there in regard to who they will point the finger at. I'm sure once I got something like this up and running, and if it did gather momentum and people did make such runs on things, that I'd be the first one they put a bullet in the head on. And, that is the risk of doing something like this. But at the end of the day, are we going to suffer the consequences of them still having the finger on the button to collapse the system? And what is the acceptable amount for people now to realize that they need to get out of the money, they need to get out of the stocks and shares, and they need to get out of their pensions and investments, because it is going to go? Do we allow a certain amount of people who are like-minded and listening to us today to do this, while unfortunately the rest of the people suffer, and we just sit back and wait then for them to collapse the system, while we've at least harvested what we can out of it and to make the best of it in regards to putting it into tangible assets.
Yeah, well, that option, I mean, that option's available to anyone. I think that was the point of, the discussion, is that you've got the ability to make your own investment decisions and to choose what you do with your money. I mean, I think the difference between the two is actually saying, this is a movement, let's try and crash the system. And whether that's an ethical thing to do and whether that's something that, would work anyways, which I don't think it would, and whether it would have longer term consequences, which I think it would be extremely damaging, probably, to the cause of trying to get human beings to come together to realize that we need to build better systems that are more holistic, and work for the benefit of everyone. Because what would probably happen is the people who got out of that, let's say you imagine you got out with your stuff and other people didn't. I
Yeah.
mean, it's a very obvious play what you do there. You'd say, it's those guys. Go get them. That's your enemy. They've
Yeah.
broken the system and they've robbed it from you. And then what you'd have is civil uprising, and they'd let that play out, and you'd lose more than your wealth, probably.
Yeah.
So that's just my. I mean, I haven't thought this one through because I haven't been asked that question before, but that's my instinct as to how it would be. And I think it'd actually be better to educate people, and allow them to come to the decisions and conclusions themselves, rather than be the instrument that actually leads to them finding it out the hard way. Yeah, I think it'd probably be better to just, share information. And that's I guess why shows like this exist, is to share information.
Oh yeah, absolutely. My only concern is we're very limited to how many people can see the information we share. And again, the very system that we use to put it out there is censoring us. We've been we've taken 2 Atlantic Underground podcasts to YouTube, and over a period of 4 years, both channels have been terminated because of the information we were putting out there. We're well aware that the information that we're giving and putting out there is being highly censored, and they'll do everything they can to shut us down from speaking. So even a movement to crash the system could be crushed just by the censorship system alone and stopping that message getting out there. But I find it highly frustrating that, we do a lot of financial talks here on this podcast. You do a lot of financial talks, and you do have a group of followers who are loyal to what you're saying and understand what you're saying. But I do really not want to see the rest of humanity suffer because they won't listen. And I really, at this point, don't know the workaround on that to do that. And, is something that can gather pace and give a strong movement, something that is brutal in its assault? Or do we just continue to do what we're doing in regards to we can save some, but not everyone?
Yeah, well, I think in life, it's personal responsibility also. It's up to individuals to engage with the opportunities to educate themselves and to learn. Ultimately, I mean, I don't have ownership over another human being or, them. Like, I think everyone should have freedom to choose, and if they choose to not educate themselves, if they choose to not listen to information that could be useful, well, that's their choice, but I wouldn't, I'm not somebody who goes around trying to force people to see my point of view. Like I said earlier, I have opinions that some people like, some opinions that some people don't like. And I'm fine, that's great. It's acceptance of the way it is. And I think ultimately, what's gonna happen in terms of cycles, these things play out anyways. They always do. And, it's a case of, you accept that we are at a point in history where there has to be some kind of reset of the system somehow. How it unfolds and, the exact path to it, I have no idea. We can see only so far into it, and therefore, you take your action and hope, you hope other people do take some action. And I want as many people as possible to survive financially. What happens, and that's why I share content and information, and it seems to find the right people. But there's other people who it's not going to find. But I can't I can't save the world. I'm not, and I don't try and assume that role either. I say I focus on people who are receptive to the message, and I try and support them as best I can, and give information that is useful and actual actually going to be of value to them, add value and allow them to think for themselves too and say, this is what I think. Maybe it's incorrect. So please do your own research. And I would say that to anyone, whatever I say, it's opinions based on research, but I'm not a genius. I'm not anything special. Always do your own research. Always check things out for yourself. And maybe you'll agree with me, or maybe you'll say, actually, no, I think he's got it wrong on his take, and that's cool. That's the way it should be in life. I think
Oh,
all of us
absolutely.
having that creative capacity to make decisions for ourselves.
And that's all we can do. We can float the ideas out there, and the feedback that we get and the information that we get based on that feedback is something that can form something better moving forward in the future. The last thing I'm going to mention today, again, we're going to go back to the Great Taking. One of the things that was wanted from the purpose of the Great Taking is that it would inform a lot of the high-ranking CEOs and people within business as to the risk of moving forward with the narratives of the system and the Great Taking, where they're going to steal the financial wealth of the majority of the people around the world. Are we seeing any progress in regards to people within big industry around the world, the CEOs and the major people that control the hubs of those industries, being alerted to this? And as much as we think AI is an enemy of ours, is it possible that we could use AI to get the message of the Great Taking out to all of these key players within industry? What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I don't know anything about AI, so I have no idea. Besides what the everyday man on the street would know, simple stuff about it. And in terms of the Great Taking, I don't know. I don't know who knows what about it, but I do know that message has spread far and wide. I mean, there's a YouTube channel for the documentary and the documentary is being watched like 700,000 times, which is a huge amount on YouTube. And I know for a fact that the financial world has all read that book. The biggest channels out there, Mike Maloney at Gold and Silver, he's done a ton of episodes on it. These are the biggest channels in finance and the investing community. My interview with Tom Bodrovics has had 73,000 views. These are all collectively, that's a lot. That's a lot of numbers. So I would imagine that anyone and everyone who's involved in finance has at least had it come across their table and had a chance to look at it. And of course, there are actually hearings taking place now in the US in certain states who are saying, well, maybe we're going to try and, protect our citizens from this. But it's a complex thing. And, somebody would have to have a very advanced knowledge of law and securities law to truly make sense of it. So a lot of people, it's the same as any other thing that we've discussed, technologies, for example. It's the same as in you have to trust somebody else's take on it. You have to trust that they've deciphered it well because you are not the expert on that part. There's very few people who understand securities law and also the legalese that's involved in, laws around bankruptcy and collateral. It's extremely complex, those documents. You have to really spend, well, I would say years getting to grips with the legal side of it. So I don't know. I don't know what they would do in that situation, but I think there's a lot of eyes on that subject to see where's it gonna go, and is it ultimately something that I need to be worried about?
Definitely. And did you also, I know you mentioned about things going on in different places and different countries. Were you aware that there's certain states within the US now that are trying to push bills through that allow gold and silver to become currency for those states?
Yeah, I know it's happening in Tennessee, and I think South Dakota as well might have had a bill. I'm not sure if it was South Dakota, but it might have been, or maybe North Dakota. But yeah, that's happening as well. So these are interesting times because clearly there is a strong lobby amongst everyday people for financial outlets that give them more freedom when it comes to their money and less exposure to a system, which I, imagine they are looking at and seeing the same things that we're seeing. So that's hopeful, because that's people naturally coming to the right conclusions that actually there are solutions out there, the very simple ones that have been around for thousands of years, whether that's in terms of food, whether that's in terms of financial vehicles, whether that's in terms of medicine, they all already exist. Everything that we need is provided not by man, but by nature. All wealth comes from nature. Your health comes from nature. Everything is within your grasp. You don't need a gym to get fit and train. You don't need drugs to get yourself healthy. That's bad health, not good health. And you don't need a special potion to fix yourself. You've got good food that exists, organic food. And you don't need companies to provide everything for you because you can provide a lot for yourself.
Yeah.
So this is a paradigm shift. And I think since, well, let's just say the last 4 years, many people have had a paradigm shift and they're starting to realize these things.
Yeah.
And the financial part of it is just one part of a greater whole of people saying, actually, yeah, I don't need to be told how to do all of these things to get by and live. I can make sense of it myself. I can do my own study. I don't need to be told by the experts, and that's a great thing. I think that's only going to continue in the coming years.
Yeah, definitely. I think this is a good point to wrap it up. It's always great to talk to a fellow Englishman in a foreign land. And, is there anything else you want to mention before we go, Mike? Or is there any way you want to let people know where they can find you and see your work?
Yeah, for sure. I've got a YouTube channel, a Rumble channel. I think I'm on BitChute as well now. That's Parallel Systems or Parallel Systems Broadcast. If you search for that, you will find my channels. I've also got a podcast called the Parallel Mike Podcast, which is where I do some deeper dive episodes, and they're a little bit more eclectic than just the financial stuff. But the financial stuff is Parallel Systems Broadcast. We've also got a private community that's been going for probably about 2 years now. We've got people from all across the world. Some of those people are investors. Some of those people are people who are homesteading, growing their own food, creating their own systems. And, we share information and, yeah, keep each other sane during these difficult times. And you can find that on my Patreon at Parallel Systems, patreon.com Parallel Systems. So, yeah, there's plenty there to check out. You can go and see what I do. And if you like it, then you can subscribe and stick around. If you don't, then you can not.
And that's it. All I can say to people now as we end. Time is one thing that Mike mentioned that is probably the greatest value to us all. Subscribe to the likes of Mike's YouTube channel. Subscribe to the Atlantic Underground podcast website. Have a look at what we're doing. Have a look at what we're saying. But if you're on a drive in your car, if you're out doing the gardening, if you're working around the house vacuuming, consider the time that you have that you can use to your best ability, not only to educate yourself, but to get into the mindset of protecting yourself as we move forward. Stick your headphones on, link it up to the stereo in the car. Don't worry about listening to music for now. Get yourself in a position where you know what's happening and you can protect you and your family moving forward. And I think that's probably the best thing to end it on. And I'll say thank you again once more to Mike for coming on. And I look forward again to us talking. We're going to probably pick another subject in the future. And we'll sit down and we'll hash it all out. And we'll see if we can get people on the right track and at least knowing what myself and Mike are doing to protect ourselves. Thanks again, Mike. This has been absolutely incredible.
Thank you, Chris. I'll see you next time.
Cheers, mate. Thanks.